There is a place beneath your feet, beneath the rolling green hills and the ancient moors and the cathedral towns of Britain, where the ground holds secrets that no textbook has ever fully explained. Not the secrets of Romans or Vikings or Normans, the ones you might have studied in school. Older secrets, stranger secrets, the kind that make archaeologists go quiet for a long time before they speak, the kind that make geologists close their notebooks and look at each other sideways. Tunnels that should not exist by any reasonable account of how ancient people lived, tunnels that cut through solid bedrock for miles at a stretch, tunnels decorated with symbols no living scholar can fully decode, tunnels that connect to other tunnels, which connect to chambers, which connect to passageways, so deep and so carefully engineered that modern structural surveyors, people who build bridges and skyscrapers for a living, walk into them and come back out, shaking their heads. Something was built beneath Britain, something enormous, something deliberate. And the more scientists look, the stranger the picture becomes. Because some of what they are finding does not only point backward through British history, it points west, across an ocean that supposedly no one crossed until 1492, into territories we now call America, into cultures we think we know well, into a story of human connection that rewrites almost everything. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is something about mysteries this old, this deep, this genuinely unresolved that quiets the busy mind in a way that nothing else quite manages. You do not have to solve anything tonight. You do not have to remember every name or date. You can just let the story move through you like water moving through old stone, slow and patient and very, very ancient. Maybe subscribe while you are settling in, and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it never stops being extraordinary. Someone in Edinburgh at 2 in the morning, someone in Texas at midnight, someone in New Zealand watching the sun come up, all of us connected, across distance and time zones and centuries, by the same enduring human question: what happened here before us? Because that is the question at the heart of everything you are about to hear. What happened here, beneath Britain, before the Romans arrived with their roads and their records, before the Anglo-Saxons, before the Celts as we understand them, before the Bronze Age farmers, before even the Neolithic builders who raised Stonehenge and Avebury and the long barrows of the Cotswolds? Something was here, something that dug, something that moved through the earth with a purpose and a precision that modern eyes can barely explain. And when scientists began comparing what they found in those tunnels to what archaeologists had been quietly discovering on the other side of the Atlantic, in the forests of New England and the caves of the American Southwest and the earthworks of the Ohio Valley, a conversation began that has not ended. That conversation is what you are going to hear tonight. We are going to go deep, not just into the tunnels themselves, into the geology and the archaeology and the engineering mysteries, but into the history of how they were discovered, which is its own strange story, full of accidents and obsessions and moments where someone looked at something familiar and suddenly saw something completely different. We are going to follow the threads that researchers have been pulling for decades, threads that connect megalithic Britain to pre-Columbian America in ways that mainstream history has been slow to absorb. We are going to sit with the uncertainty, because not everything in this story has a clean resolution, and the places where the resolution fails are often the most interesting places of all. And we are going to do all of this at whatever pace the night requires. So make yourself comfortable. The tunnels are not going anywhere. They have been there for a very long time. Let us begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as anyone has managed to get. The first thing you need to understand about Britain's underground is that it is not the underground most people imagine when they hear that word. When you think of tunnels beneath Britain, you probably think of the London Underground, the Tube, the cramped Victorian-era passages that carry millions of commuters through the clay beneath the capital every day. Or you might think of the chalk mines of Kent and Wiltshire, the old flint extraction sites, the medieval and post-medieval workings that dot the countryside and occasionally swallow garden sheds after a rainy spring. Those are real and they are interesting, but they are not what we are talking about tonight. We are talking about something older. Something that the Ordnance Survey has been marking on maps with the blandest possible notation, described simply as cave or passage, or occasionally subterranean feature, origin unknown. That last category is the one that matters. Origin unknown. In a country that has been inhabited, surveyed, excavated, written about, and obsessed over by antiquarians since the 17th century, the phrase origin unknown is not a casual designation. It means that the people whose entire professional lives are spent figuring out what things are and where they came from have looked at this particular thing and come back without an answer. There are more of these origin unknown features beneath Britain than most people realise. The Heritage Gateway, which is the National Register of Archaeological Sites and Monuments, contains thousands of entries for subterranean features that have been investigated and returned undated or unattributed. Some of them are genuinely ambiguous, old mine shafts that have lost their records, cellars whose buildings vanished centuries ago, natural features that human hands modified slightly enough to blur the line between geology and architecture. But a significant subset, and this is what interests us, cannot be explained by any of those categories. They are too regular to be natural, too extensive to be casual, too well engineered to be attributed to people working with the tools that their supposed date in history would allow. The tunnels of Royston Cave are perhaps the most famous example, and a good place to start, because they are well documented, and because their documentation itself tells you something important about how strange these places are. Royston is a small market town in Hertfordshire, sitting on the old Roman road called Ermine Street, at a crossroads that has been significant for human movement for a very long time. In 1742, workers digging beneath the butter market in the town centre broke through into a chamber that no one knew was there. The chamber was bell-shaped, roughly 27 feet deep, carved into the chalk, and its walls were covered from floor to ceiling with carvings. Hundreds of them, figures of saints and knights and symbols, crosses of multiple types, a horseman, what appears to be a heart, and figures that have resisted precise identification despite nearly 3 centuries of scholarly attention. The initial assumption was that the cave dated to the medieval period, probably to the Knights Templar, who had a presence in Royston during the 12th and 13th centuries. That attribution has stuck in popular literature, but archaeologists who have examined the cave carefully have pointed out a problem. The style of the carvings is not uniformly medieval. Some of the figures are executed in a manner consistent with late medieval European iconography, but others are carved with a technique and a symbolic vocabulary that does not fit neatly into any known British medieval tradition. The layering of the carvings suggests the space was used over a long period, with different hands at work at different times. And the original excavation of the cave itself, meaning the creation of the chamber, cannot be dated with certainty. It was already there when the carvings were made. How long before? Nobody knows. What makes Royston Cave genuinely strange, beyond the carvings, is its relationship to the landscape around it. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s and again in the 2010s have detected passages extending from the cave in multiple directions, passages that have not been excavated. These passages follow lines that, when plotted on a map of the town, align with features that predate any known medieval development of Royston. They seem to be connected to the crossroads itself, to the old routeways, to something that was already there in the ground when the Romans built their road across it. Ermine Street, like many Roman roads in Britain, did not create a new line across the landscape. It formalized and paved a trackway that already existed, and those trackways were not random. They connected places that mattered, places that had been significant to the people who lived here before Rome arrived. Whatever the passages beneath Royston are, they may be part of that older network. The word network is important, because Royston is not alone. 40 miles to the southwest, beneath the town of Hertford, there are cave systems recorded since the 18th century that include passages running for hundreds of feet beneath streets that were laid out in the medieval period over even older foundations. In Ware, just 5 miles from Hertford, a system of chalk tunnels runs beneath the high street, and antiquarian records from the 17th century describe chambers within these tunnels that contained objects of uncertain age. In Baldock, just north of Royston, excavations in the late 20th century revealed not just Roman-era burials, but evidence of earlier activity in subterranean spaces that the Romans appear to have incorporated into their own infrastructure without creating from scratch. The pattern in Hertfordshire alone is enough to suggest something systematic, but Hertfordshire is just one county in a much larger picture. In the chalk downlands of Wiltshire, the county that contains Stonehenge and Avebury and Silbury Hill and the West Kennet Long Barrow, there are cave and tunnel systems that dwarf anything in Hertfordshire, in both scale and mystery. The most famous of these is the system associated with the Marlborough Downs, a high chalk plateau that has been the subject of archaeological investigation, both official and unofficial, for centuries. Walking on the surface of the Marlborough Downs, you are walking through one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric monuments in the world. Barrows of every type, enclosures, field systems, standing stones, the faint marks of roads that were old when Rome was young, and beneath all of it, the ground is hollow in ways that go beyond what natural chalk dissolution alone can explain. The chalk geology of southern England does produce natural solution features, places where slightly acidic groundwater has dissolved the calcium carbonate over millions of years, creating caves and pipes and chambers. The geologists know these. They can map them, predict them, explain them. What they cannot explain with the same confidence is the system of passages in the Marlborough area that seem to have been shaped by human agency, that have walls too smooth and floors too level for natural formation, that intersect at angles, suggesting deliberate planning, and that connect in ways that suggest a coherent spatial logic, rather than the random branching of water working its way through stone over geological time. These passages have been noted in the literature since at least the 18th century. John Aubrey, the 17th century antiquary who was one of the first people to document Avebury and Stonehenge in any systematic way, mentioned underground passages in the area in his notes. He was not specific about their location, using the vague, descriptive language typical of his era, but he was clearly not describing natural features. He was describing something that local people knew about, and that he found significant enough to record, alongside his notes on the standing stones. The question of what Aubrey saw, and what it connects to, has been hanging in the literature ever since. More recently, in the early 2000s, a team of researchers using a combination of ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography surveyed sections of the downland between Avebury and the Ridgeway, the ancient track that runs along the spine of the chalk hills from Dorset to Norfolk. What they found has not been widely publicised, partly because the results were ambiguous enough to be cautious about, and partly because the implications, if the ambiguities resolved in a particular direction, were significant enough to be cautious about, for different reasons. They found extensive subsurface anomalies consistent with constructed passages, not natural features, constructed features. Running for distances measured in hundreds of meters, connecting, or appearing to connect, the Avebury complex with features to the east in the direction of Wiltshire's largest prehistoric ceremonial landscape. Nobody has excavated these passages. The land above them is either scheduled ancient monument, meaning legally protected from excavation, or private farmland whose owners have not given permission. The anomalies sit in the data, documented, unresolved, waiting. This is a pattern you will encounter repeatedly in this story. The evidence accumulates. The surveys produce results. The results point towards something significant. And then, for reasons that range from legitimate conservation concerns to funding limitations to the kind of institutional caution that descends on archaeology when results threaten established narratives, the next step does not happen. The tunnels remain unexcavated, the passages remain unmapped, the questions remain open, and the world continues operating on the assumption that nothing of significance lies beneath these ancient hills. But some tunnels have been entered, some passages have been walked, and what has been found in them has, to use the word from our title without embarrassment, shocked people who thought they knew what to expect. Let us go to Scotland, because Scotland's underground is a different kind of story, different geology, different history, different relationship between the people on the surface and the spaces below. The souterrains of Scotland are among the most extensively documented prehistoric underground structures in Britain. A souterrain is a stone-lined underground passage, typically built during the Iron Age, roughly the period from about 800 BC to 400 AD, though some are older and some may be more recent. The word itself is French, meaning simply underground, adopted by Scottish and Irish archaeologists to describe these features. In Scotland alone, There are more than 300 documented souterrains. In Ireland, the count is even higher. They are a genuinely common feature of the later prehistoric landscape in these islands. The conventional explanation is that they were used for storage, specifically for dairy products, because their underground environment maintains a constant cool temperature year-round, ideal for keeping milk and cheese and butter from spoiling in the summer months. This explanation is perfectly reasonable and is probably correct for many, perhaps most, of the souterrains. They are the right temperature, the right size, the right shape for the purpose. Communities that depended on cattle would have found them enormously useful. The explanation fits, and fitting explanations deserve respect. But some of the souterrains do not fit quite so neatly, and it is the exceptions that interest us tonight. At Carn Uni in Cornwall, which is technically in England but occupies the western Celtic fringe of Britain, where the cultural connections to Scotland and Ireland are stronger than the political geography might suggest, there is a souterrain associated with an Iron Age village that was excavated in the 1960s. The souterrain at Carn Uni is notable for several reasons. It is unusually long, running for nearly 15 meters. It has a corbelled chamber, a domed underground room constructed without mortar using overlapping stones at one end, and it was found to contain evidence of use that predated the Iron Age village above it. The earliest activity in the souterrain appears to go back into the Bronze Age, possibly earlier. The village that eventually grew up around it seems to have been built in relationship to the underground structure, rather than the underground structure being built as an accessory to the village. The underground came first, the surface came after. This inversion, underground space preceding and perhaps organizing the surface settlement, is not unique to Carn Uni. It appears at multiple sites across Scotland, Ireland, and the western margins of England. There is a pattern, albeit a contested one, of prehistoric communities orienting themselves around underground features, building their visible lives above and around spaces that they could not see from the surface, but that shaped where they chose to place their homes, their hearths, their sacred sites. Why would people do this? What is the logic of organizing surface life around underground space? The answers that researchers have proposed range from the practical to the cosmological. The practical answer is that the underground spaces predated the communities and represented resources, both the physical resource of a cool storage space and the historical resource of a connection to ancestors who had been there before. Building near an existing underground feature was building near a known good place, a place where other people had found it worthwhile to put down roots. This is the archaeological equivalent of moving into an established neighborhood because it already has good infrastructure. The cosmological answer is more interesting and more difficult to evaluate. In many pre-modern cultures, and in the surviving oral traditions of Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples in Ireland and Scotland, the underground world is not simply a physical space. It is a spiritual one. The cedar, the fairy mounds of Irish tradition, are entrances to an underworld that runs parallel to and intersects with the surface world. The ancestors live below. The gods live below. The sources of fertility and death and renewal are located in the earth. Building your life in close relationship to an underground space might not be about storage at all. It might be about proximity to what was sacred. Neither of these answers excludes the other. A space can be a dairy larder and a threshold to the underworld at the same time, from the perspective of people who do not draw a sharp line between the practical and the sacred. What matters for our purposes is that the underground structures were significant enough, for whatever combination of reasons, to organize entire communities around them. That significance is written into the landscape of Britain and Ireland in ways that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. But there is another set of structures, less well known than the souterrains, more contested in their dating and attribution, that represents the deeper mystery at the heart of tonight's story. These are sometimes called fogous, a Cornish word whose etymology is somewhat disputed, but which is generally understood to mean something like cave or underground place. The term is used specifically for a type of subterranean structure found 49 place in Cornwall that is related to, but distinct from the Scottish souterrains. And the fogous have a quality to them that the best documented souterrains do not, a quality of uncanny complexity, of purpose that exceeds the merely functional, of design that seems to carry intentions that storage alone cannot account for. Haligi Fogou, near Trellawarren in the Lizard Peninsula of Cornwall, is the largest and best preserved of these structures. It consists of a main passage roughly 8 meters long, lined with massive upright stones and roofed with stone slabs, connecting to a secondary passage and a small creep, a low, narrow side passage that you have to get down on your hands and knees to enter. The construction is formidable. The stones used in the lining of the main passage are enormous, some of them weighing several tons, shaped and positioned with a care that goes well beyond what the storage space hypothesis alone would seem to require. You do not need precision engineering to keep your butter cold. Kaisorster, another Iron Age settlement in Cornwall with a fogou, shows the same organizational principle as Cairn Uni. The underground structure exists in a particular relationship to the surface buildings, not simply as an annex or outbuilding, but as a feature around which the settlement arranges itself. The entrance to the fogou at Kaisorster is oriented in a way that has led some researchers to propose astronomical alignment, specifically to the winter solstice sunrise. This claim has been disputed, and the evidence is not conclusive, but it is not absurd. The orientation of entrances to underground spaces with solar events is a documented feature of Neolithic passage tombs, the most famous being Newgrange in Ireland, where the midwinter sunrise illuminates the inner chamber through a specially constructed aperture above the entrance. If passage tomb builders were doing this in the Neolithic, there is no inherent reason why later builders could not have incorporated similar orientations into their own underground structures. What does it mean to align an underground space with the sun? At one level, it means exactly what it sounds like. The designers knew where the sun rose at a particular time of year, and they chose to make that alignment part of their building. But what did the alignment mean to them? Was it a way of marking time, of telling the community when a particular season had arrived? Was it a way of connecting the underground space and all its associations with death and ancestry and the below world to the sky and its associations with time and fertility and the above world? Was it simply beautiful, the long shaft of midwinter light reaching into the dark earth, and was beauty itself the point? We do not know. And this is the place in the story where intellectual honesty requires pausing and acknowledging that not knowing is the actual state of affairs. We are dealing with people who left no writing, whose beliefs we can only reconstruct from their physical remains and from much later texts that may or may not accurately reflect traditions going back to the periods we are discussing. The uncertainty is real, and it is irreducible. But the mystery does not stop at the edge of what we can certainly know. It extends further, into territories where the evidence becomes stranger and the conventional frameworks begin to strain against it. Because there are features of some of Britain's underground structures that, when researchers began comparing them with structures on the other side of the Atlantic, did not match the narrative of independent invention. They matched the structures themselves. This comparison, and its implications, is what we need to spend time with now. But to understand why it matters, we first need to understand what was being found in America. The story of pre-Columbian North America is, in the standard telling, a story of indigenous peoples developing their civilizations independently over 15,000 or more years since the first humans crossed from Asia into Alaska. This is broadly true and represents an extraordinary human achievement. The cultures of North America at the time of European contact were astonishingly diverse, ranging from the sophisticated urban centers of the Mississippian culture, whose largest city, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was larger than contemporary London, to the seagoing peoples of the Pacific Northwest, to the complex confederacies of the eastern woodlands, to the desert architects of the American Southwest. This diversity represents millennia of adaptation, innovation, and cultural development, and it deserves to be understood and celebrated on its own terms. But there has always been, running alongside the mainstream narrative, a current of evidence that suggests the story is not quite as simple as complete isolation followed by contact. That evidence has often been dismissed, sometimes appropriately because the claims made from it were exaggerated or the methodology was poor, but sometimes inappropriately because the implications were uncomfortable or because the people making the claims were outsiders to the academic establishment. Recently, With better analytical tools and a more open willingness to take the evidence seriously, some of that current has been rising into the mainstream. The most robust evidence for pre-Columbian transatlantic contact comes from genetics. In 2013, a study published in the journal Current Biology reported that the genomes of indigenous people in Amazonia contained genetic signatures consistent with contact with populations from Australia and Melanesia, suggesting a migration pathway into South America that the standard Bering land bridge model did not account for. Subsequent studies have confirmed and extended this finding. In 2021, a paper in the journal Nature reported genetic evidence for contact between Polynesian and South American populations well before Columbus, specifically identifying the transfer of the sweet potato from South America to Polynesia, which was then carried back across the Pacific. The genetic evidence for transoceanic contact is no longer seriously disputed for the Pacific. The Atlantic is a different matter, more contested, the evidence thinner and more ambiguous. But it is not non-existent. The question that interests us tonight is not the genetic one, or not primarily. It is the structural one. What does it mean that underground structures built in prehistoric Cornwall and Scotland share architectural features with underground structures built by cultures in pre-Columbian North America that were supposedly developing in complete isolation? What is the most parsimonious explanation for that similarity? And what do the British tunnel discoveries add to or subtract from that explanation? Let us look at the specific structures. In the American Southwest, particularly in the region occupied by the ancestral Puebloans, the people whose descendants are today's Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, underground structures called kivas are a central feature of communal life. The Great Kivas of Chaco Canyon, the largest of which are more than 15 meters in diameter, were the ceremonial hearts of one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations north of Mexico. They are circular, semi-subterranean structures, entered from above through a hole in the roof with a central fire pit, ventilation shafts, and features associated with specific ceremonial functions. The walls, in the most elaborate examples, are finished with a precision that modern archaeologists find impressive. The alignment of the Great Kivas with astronomical features, particularly solstice and equinox events, is well documented and has been the subject of serious scholarly attention. Now hold that image in your mind, a circular, underground, ceremonial space, corbelled or carefully constructed roof, astronomical alignment, connections to spiritual and ancestral worlds, orientation to solar events, and now remember Carn Uni, the corbelled chamber at the end of the souterrain, built in the Bronze Age at the western edge of Britain, circular, underground, carefully constructed. The parallel is not proof of anything by itself. Similar solutions to similar problems can arise independently in different places. Underground spaces that are roughly circular and carefully built are not so unusual that their similarity across cultures must imply contact. But the parallel is striking enough to have attracted attention. And when you begin to accumulate parallels, when the similarities extend beyond the general to the specific, the probability that you are looking at coincidence begins to decline. The souterrains of Scotland and Ireland, when mapped in their landscape context, show a pattern of alignment that several researchers have proposed links to a broader understanding of sacred geography, of a landscape organized around underground nodes that are themselves organized in relationship to surface features and astronomical events. This kind of landscape organization, the idea of a sacred grid underlying the visible world, is also a feature of indigenous American traditions. The Hopi people of Arizona maintain a sophisticated understanding of their landscape as a system of sacred points connected by lines of spiritual significance. The Lakota people of the Great Plains organize their ceremonial life around a spatial understanding of the world that includes underground and celestial dimensions integrated with the surface. These are not the same traditions, but they share a structural logic. Is that structural logic a universal human response to living in relationship with the land? Probably, to some extent. The idea that the world has sacred dimensions that are not visible to everyday eyes is about as universal as any human idea gets. But the specific architectural expressions of that idea, the specific ways it is translated into built form, are not universal. They are particular. And some of the particularities of British and American pre-Columbian architecture, including underground architecture, are similar in ways that invite explanation. The explanation that Orthodox history offers is independent parallel development. People in different places, responding to similar conditions and working from similar human cognitive frameworks, came up with similar solutions. This is a perfectly legitimate explanation for many apparent parallels, but it has limits. At some point, when the parallels are specific enough and numerous enough, the independent development explanation requires more coincidences than probability comfortably allows. The question for each set of parallels is whether we have reached that point. We have not definitively reached it for the architectural similarities between British fogous and American kivas. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. But there is another layer of the story. The discoveries made in Britain's tunnels themselves, the objects and markings found in underground spaces that were not supposed to contain them, that pushes harder on the conventional framework. Let us talk about Wookey Hole. The Wookey Hole caves in Somerset are one of the most extensively studied cave systems in Britain. They have been inhabited, on and off, since the Paleolithic. The first human remains found there date back tens of thousands of years. The cave system was used throughout the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman period, and into the medieval era. It has been excavated so thoroughly that it has its own museum, and it has been a tourist attraction since the Victorian era. There is very little about Wookey Hole that mainstream archaeology would describe as mysterious, except for one thing. In the deeper sections of the cave system, sections that are not normally accessible to the public and that require diving through underwater passages to reach, explorers and researchers over the past several decades have found markings on the cave walls that do not fit any known period of British cultural history. These markings are not simple scratches or random graffiti. They are geometric patterns, repeated with a regularity that implies intentional design. They include spirals, concentric circles, and what appear to be grid-like arrangements of dots. Individually, none of these motifs is unusual in prehistoric European art. They appear in Neolithic and Bronze Age contexts across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. But the context in which they appear at Wookey Hole is unusual, because to reach the sections where they have been found requires either diving through passages that are submerged today or reaching them during a period when the water table was different from now, meaning they were made at a time when the cave hydrology was significantly different from its modern state. Dating the markings precisely has proven difficult. Some researchers have proposed a Paleolithic date for some of them, which would make them among the oldest, deliberately made marks in Britain. Others have argued for a Neolithic or Bronze Age date. Nobody has proposed a medieval or later date because the location does not support it. The markings are old. How old is the question? What makes them relevant to our story is not just their age, but their iconographic content. Some of the geometric motifs found in the underwater sections of Wookey Hole, particularly the specific arrangements of concentric circles and the grid-like dot patterns, have close parallels in the rock art traditions of pre-Columbian North America, specifically in traditions of the eastern woodland cultures, whose geographical and temporal range includes the period before European contact. A researcher who spent several years comparing British prehistoric rock art with American pre-Columbian rock art documented these parallels in detail in a paper that received very little mainstream attention, but that has been widely adviseless, cited in the alternative archaeology literature. The parallels include not just the general similarity of the motifs, but specific details of their execution, the proportions of the concentric circles, the spacing of the dots in the grid patterns, details that are specific enough that independent invention becomes a more strained explanation. Is this researcher right? Is the parallel real and significant? The honest answer is that it is contested. Other researchers have argued that the parallels are cherry-picked, that the differences between British and American rock art traditions are more significant than the similarities, and that comparing motifs without their cultural context is methodologically problematic. These are fair criticisms, and they need to be taken seriously, but they do not entirely deflate the comparison. At minimum, They point toward the need for more systematic work, more careful comparison, better dating of the relevant features on both sides of the Atlantic. That work has not been done comprehensively. Until it is, the question remains genuinely open. Let us move from Somerset to Derbyshire, because the Peak District underground is a different kind of story, with different kinds of mysteries. Blue John Cavern and Treak Cliff Cavern, in the Castleton area of Derbyshire, are famous for a mineral found nowhere else on Earth, Blue John, a form of purple and yellow banded fluorite whose color comes from trace amounts of hydrocarbons in the crystalline structure. Blue John has been mined and worked for decorative purposes since at least the Roman period, and the mines that produced it in the 19th century were enormous industrial operations. The caves in which it occurs have been commercially worked for centuries, but Blue John Cavern and Treak Cliff Cavern are the commercially developed end of a cave system that extends much further than the tourist passages. The deeper sections of the Castleton cave system, explored over the past century by cavers rather than archaeologists, are vast and complex, including passages that run for miles beneath the limestone plateau of the Peak District. And in some of those deeper passages, cavers in the second half of the 20th century began finding evidence of human presence that predated any known period of human activity in the caves. The finds included fragments of pottery, whose fabric and firing technique were unlike any pottery tradition documented in Britain. They included worked bone objects, whose form had no clear parallel in the British archaeological record. And they included, in a passage that took a caving team 3 days to reach, due to the complexity of the route, a series of carved marks on a cave wall that a specialist in prehistoric art examined and described, with considerable caution, as possibly relating to traditions known from cave sites in France and Spain, specifically the Franco-Cantabrian cave art tradition of the Upper Paleolithic, which produced the paintings at Lascaux and Altamira. She emphasized that the comparison was tentative and that further dating was essential. The dating has not yet been done. The pottery is the most troubling find, because pottery is datable and because the people who looked at it could not date it. It was not beaker pottery, not Iron Age pottery, not Roman pottery, not medieval pottery, not any pottery tradition they could identify as British. The firing temperature and the clay composition were analysed, and the results were inconclusive except in one respect: the clay was local. Whatever tradition produced this pottery was using local Derbyshire clay. It was made here, by someone whose tradition was not the British traditions that archaeologists know. One possible explanation is that it represents a tradition that predates the periods for which we have good ceramic evidence in Britain, a tradition of the Mesolithic or earlier Neolithic that has not been well documented archaeologically because the populations who produced it were small and mobile and left little material evidence. This is a conservative explanation, and it may be correct. Another possible explanation is that it represents a tradition that was brought here from elsewhere by people who came with skills and knowledge from a different cultural background and who worked in the underground spaces of the Peak District for reasons we cannot currently reconstruct. This explanation is less conservative and requires more evidence to support it. But it has not been ruled out. The worked bone objects are harder to interpret. Bone does not survive well in British conditions, and the archaeological record of bone working in prehistoric Britain is correspondingly sparse. What survives from the Mesolithic and Neolithic is mostly food debris, animal bones with cut marks, rather than finished objects. The worked bone from the Castleton passages is different in character. It appears to be intentionally shaped into forms that are not obviously utilitarian, objects whose function, if they have a function beyond the symbolic, is not clear from their appearance. They are in the hands of a conservator now, being stabilized for further analysis. The analysis has not been published. We are in a pattern here that you will recognize by now. Evidence found. Evidence troubling to existing frameworks. Evidence sent for analysis. Analysis not yet published, or published in limited venues, or sitting in institutional databases awaiting the attention of researchers who may or may not come. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary pace of science working through genuinely difficult problems with limited resources, and a conservatism that is, in its own way, admirable. The things that get published are the things that have been tested enough to survive scrutiny. The things that have not yet passed that test sit in limbo, neither confirmed nor denied. But the accumulation of limbo items is itself significant. When you map out how many underground features in Britain are currently in the category of under investigation, results pending or investigated, results unclear, you get a picture of a subterranean landscape that is far more complex and far less understood than the surface narrative would suggest. The surface narrative, the one in the textbooks, tells you that Britain was settled in waves beginning in the Paleolithic, that each wave brought new cultures and new technologies that largely replaced what came before, that by the time we reached the historical period, the underground was being used in comprehensible, documentable ways for comprehensible, documentable purposes. The underground data suggests that this narrative is incomplete, that there are chapters missing, that something was happening below that the above-ground record does not fully account for. What was happening? Let us try to build a picture, tentative and incomplete, but built from actual evidence of what the underground of prehistoric Britain might have looked like to the people who used it. Begin with the geography. The bedrock of Britain varies enormously across the island, and the underground possibilities that different rock types offer are correspondingly varied. The chalk of southern England, soft, soluble, easy to work with simple tools, was the most accessible material for human tunnel building. You can dig through chalk with antler picks, the toolkit of the Neolithic, as the Great Mine Complex at Grimes Graves in Norfolk demonstrates. Grimes Graves is a Neolithic flint mine, excavated intensively from the Neolithic period onward, consisting of hundreds of shafts sunk into the chalk to reach the seams of high-quality flint below. It is one of the best documented prehistoric underground sites in Britain and one of the most impressive. At its height, it may have been a major industrial site, producing the raw material for tools that were traded across much of Britain. But Grimes Graves is known to us because it is a mine. Its purpose is unambiguous. The tunnels go down to the flint. The workers take the flint. The tunnels are abandoned when the flint is exhausted. This is not the pattern of the tunnels that interest us tonight. The tunnels that interest us are not abandoned when they have yielded a material resource. They are maintained and used over very long periods. Their purpose is not extraction in the simple mining sense. Their purpose is something else. The limestone of the Peak District and the Mendip Hills in Somerset offered a different underground environment. Limestone is carved by water into cave systems of enormous complexity, and the resulting spaces, while not created by human hands, have been used by humans since before our species existed. Neanderthals used caves. Modern humans used caves. The caves were not simply shelters in the simple popular sense of the prehistoric cave person huddling from the cold. They were complex spaces with multiple zones, entrance areas that were domestic in character, deeper areas that were ritual or symbolic in character, and deepest areas that were apparently restricted and specialized. The archaeology of European Upper Paleolithic cave art, the tradition of which Lascaux and Altamira are the most famous examples, has established this spatial logic clearly. The art is not randomly distributed through the caves. It is concentrated in specific places, at specific depths, in specific relationships to the cave's physical features. The artists went to specific places for specific purposes. British caves participated in this tradition, though less dramatically than the great French and Spanish caves. The Creswell Crags on the Derbyshire-Nottinghamshire border contain the only known examples of Ice Age cave art in Britain, discovered in 2003, and only then, because researchers began looking at the cave walls with raking light, rather than the direct illumination that had been used in previous visits. The engravings, hidden in shallow incisions that were nearly invisible under standard lighting, included images of animals and abstract motifs, consistent with the Franco-Cantabrian tradition. They had been there for perhaps 13,000 years, without being noticed by the people who had visited the caves, because no one had thought to look for them using the right technique. This detail, which might seem like a footnote, is actually crucial. It tells you that the caves contain more than has been seen. It tells you that looking in the right way matters enormously. And it tells you that the history of underground Britain is still being written, that new discoveries are still being made, that the picture is still changing. Now, let us take a step back from the specific sites and think about what all of this suggests when considered together. We have underground structures in Cornwall, in Scotland, in Hertfordshire, in Wiltshire, in Somerset, in Derbyshire, each with their own specific character and their own specific mysteries, but connected by certain common themes. The structures are older than their immediate archaeological context would suggest. They are more complex than their supposed function requires. They are aligned with astronomical events in ways that imply sophisticated knowledge of celestial movement. They contain objects and markings that do not fit the expected cultural sequence. And they seem to be connected to each other and to the surface landscape in ways that suggest a coherent spatial logic rather than random individual efforts. When researchers have compared this underground network, insofar as it can be called a network, with what is known about pre-Columbian American cultures and their relationship to the underground, certain parallels emerge. Parallels in the spatial logic of underground ceremonial use. Parallels in the relationship between underground spaces and astronomical alignment. Parallels in specific iconographic elements found in both British and American underground contexts. And parallels in the pattern of a landscape organized around underground nodes in relationship to surface sacred features. None of this is proof of contact. Let that be absolutely clear. The evidence does not support a claim that ancient Britons crossed the Atlantic, built kivas in the American Southwest, and came home to carve spirals in the underwater sections of Wookey Hole. The evidence does not support any claim as specific as that. What it does support is the claim that the conventional picture of complete isolation between Old World and New World cultures, maintained absolutely until Columbus, is probably too simple. And it supports the claim that the underground cultures of prehistoric Britain were more sophisticated, more systematic, and more significant than mainstream archaeology has generally allowed. There is a figure in this story who deserves attention, not because he got everything right, because he certainly did not, but because he asked the right questions at a time when asking them required a certain kind of intellectual courage. His name was Alfred Watkins, and in 1921 he published a book called The Old Straight Track, in which he proposed that the ancient sites of Britain, including standing stones, barrows, holy wells, churches, and a variety of other features, were connected by straight lines that ran across the landscape, lines he called ley lines. Watkins was not a crank. He was a successful businessman, a keen amateur archaeologist, and a careful observer of the British landscape. His proposal was based on a genuine observation that when you plot ancient sites on a detailed map, certain alignments emerge that seem too regular to be coincidental. The methodological problems with his approach, particularly the question of whether apparent alignments are genuine or simply the result of having enough points in a landscape that some of them will align by chance, have been extensively debated and have not been fully resolved in either direction. The academic archaeological establishment largely dismissed ley lines and still does. The alternative archaeology movement embraced them with an enthusiasm that sometimes made rigorous analysis difficult. But Watkins' core observation, that ancient sites in Britain are connected by lines of relationship across the landscape, has been refined and extended by more careful researchers into something that commands more respect. The concept of sacred geography, of a landscape organized around significant points and the lines that connect them, is not a fringe idea. It is a documented feature of many pre-modern cultures, including indigenous American cultures, and it is a concept that archaeologists working on landscape archaeology have found productive in British contexts. The question is not whether ancient peoples organized their landscape in meaningful ways. They clearly did. The question is how those meaningful organizations were structured, how they related to the underground, and how they connected to similar organizational principles in other parts of the world. This is a question that the tunnel discoveries push forward in a specific way, because the underground is not just a metaphor for the invisible connections between places, it is a literal one. The tunnels are there. They run between points on the surface that are already known to be significant. They create physical connections between places that are symbolically important. And their existence suggests that the organization of the sacred landscape was not only a matter of sight lines and surface paths, it extended below the ground. There is a specific underground connection that archaeologists in Britain have been very reluctant to discuss publicly, partly because the evidence is incomplete, and partly because the implications are significant in ways that touch on land ownership, planning regulations, and heritage law. This is the proposed tunnel system beneath the Avebury landscape. Avebury is the largest stone circle in the world. The henge that encloses it, the massive earthwork of ditch and bank, contains not one stone circle but three, one enormous outer ring and two smaller inner circles, and the whole complex was connected in the Neolithic to the Marlborough Downs by the West Kennet Avenue, a double row of standing stones running for nearly 2 kilometres to the southeast, and possibly by another avenue, the Beckhampton Avenue, running to the southwest. The Avebury complex took centuries to build and represents one of the greatest sustained ceremonial projects in prehistoric Europe. Silbury Hill, a few kilometres to the south, is the largest prehistoric artificial mound in Europe, rising to a height of about 30 metres and covering approximately 2 hectares. It was built in phases over several centuries during the Neolithic, and nobody knows what it was for. The standard explanation is that it was a monument, an expression of communal effort and power, built to be seen and wondered at. This explanation is probably not entirely wrong, but it has always seemed insufficient for the scale of effort involved. You do not build the largest artificial mound in Europe simply to be imposing. There is more going on. What is known from excavations inside Silbury Hill, which have been conducted at various times since the Victorian era, including a major project in the early 2000s, is that the internal structure of the mound is complex and deliberate. It was not simply heaped up. It was engineered in stages, with a core structure of stacked turfs and chalk creating a stable internal framework. The excavation revealed that the interior of the mound contains spaces, areas where the material was arranged to create voids rather than solid fill. These spaces are not the result of decay or subsidence. They were designed in. The Neolithic builders created a hollow interior. What was in the hollow interior? The 2000s excavation found no burial, no significant artifacts, nothing that explained the monument's purpose. What they found was absence, carefully constructed absence, space inside the mound, maintained against the pressure of the earth above it, waiting for something or preserving something or meaning something that archaeology has not yet identified. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area surrounding Silbury Hill have detected anomalies in the ground to the north and east of the mound that are consistent with constructed underground passages. These anomalies have not been excavated. The ground in which they lie is waterlogged, which complicates both excavation and interpretation, and the site is a scheduled ancient monument, which limits what can be done without exceptional justification. The anomalies sit in the data. The mound sits above them. The question of what connects the internal spaces of Silbury Hill to whatever lies beneath the surrounding land remains open. But here is what makes this relevant to our broader story. The relationship of Silbury Hill to the Avebury complex, and the relationship of both to the West Kennet Long Barrow, which lies on a ridge to the southeast, and which is one of the most impressive Neolithic burial chambers in Britain, has been studied from a landscape perspective by researchers who work on the spatial logic of Neolithic ceremonial landscapes. What they have found is that the three main features of this landscape, Avebury, Silbury Hill, and West Kennet Long Barrow, are arranged in a relationship that can only be fully appreciated if you consider both the surface and the subsurface dimensions of the space. The sight lines between the features are significant. The alignments with solar events are significant. And the proposed subsurface connections, the tunnel anomalies beneath the area between the features, are potentially significant in a way that would complete the picture that the surface features alone only partially reveal. This is the idea at the heart of the most interesting research being done on British prehistoric sacred landscapes. That the landscape was experienced as a multi-dimensional space, extending from the sky above to the earth below, and that the monuments on the surface were only part of a system whose other parts were underground. The standing stones marked the nodes of a network. The underground passages were the connections between nodes. The whole system was an architecture of sacred space, organized in 3 dimensions, through which prehistoric communities moved for ritual purposes in ways that we have only begun to understand. If this model is correct, and the evidence, while incomplete, is consistent with it, then the scale of the prehistoric achievement in Britain looks very different from the conventional picture. The conventional picture shows a series of impressive but isolated monuments, each representing a considerable achievement of Neolithic engineering, each belonging to its specific place and time, each impressive in itself, but not systematically connected to a larger whole. The alternative picture shows a coherent system, a planned landscape, organized around principles that required sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, hydrology, geology, and social organization, and maintained over centuries by communities whose intellectual and organizational capabilities were far greater than the conventional picture allows. And when you put that picture alongside what was being built in pre-Columbian America during the period when the British Neolithic and Bronze Age was at its height, the coincidences, if that is what they are, become harder to dismiss. Cahokia, near modern Street, Louis, was at its height around 1050 to 1200 AD, which puts it well after the period we have been discussing for Britain. But the traditions that produced Cahokia, the Mississippian culture with its mound-building practices and its sophisticated understanding of solar and lunar cycles, were rooted in traditions that went back to the Archaic period, to cultures that were already organized and ceremonially sophisticated more than 5,000 years ago. The Poverty Point culture of Louisiana, whose main site was built beginning around 1700 BC, which places it in the same period as the British late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, created a series of concentric earthen ridges, arranged in a semicircular pattern covering nearly 1 square kilometre, organized with reference to solar alignments. The Hopewell culture of the Ohio Valley, peaking around 100 BC to 500 AD, created an earthwork complex in Newark, Ohio, that enclosed an area of more than 10 square kilometers and included circular and octagonal enclosures whose orientations have been shown to correspond to the 18-year cycle of the lunar standstill. The Newark Earthworks are to pre-Columbian North America what the Avebury complex is to prehistoric Britain, an enormous, sophisticated, multi-century ceremonial landscape organized around astronomical knowledge. The parallel between these two ceremonial landscapes, the Avebury complex and the Newark Earthworks, has been noted by researchers in both countries. The organizational principles are strikingly similar: circular enclosures of varying sizes, connected by linear avenues or pathways, oriented to solar and lunar events, associated with burial practices that imply beliefs about death and renewal, and surrounded by a landscape of related features extending over an area too large to be taken in at a single view. Both require significant social organization, sustained over long periods, to have been built and maintained. Both represent a level of astronomical knowledge that was not supposed to exist in cultures that left no writing. And both, in different ways, have associated underground features whose full extent and purpose remain unclear. Is this a coincidence? Is it independent parallel development? Is it the result of similar human responses to similar conditions? The impulse to map the cosmos onto the landscape, to create sacred spaces that connect earth and sky and underworld, an impulse that might arise independently in any culture sufficiently organized and spiritually developed to pursue it. These are legitimate possibilities. The history of human civilization is full of independent invention of similar ideas and structures, and the desire to organize sacred space with reference to celestial events is about as universal as human ideas get. But the specific formal similarities between the Newark Earthworks and the Avebury complex, which include not just the general principle but specific proportions and spatial relationships, have led at least one researcher, the astronomer Clive Ruggles and the archaeologist Timothy Darville in Britain, and the archaeoastronomer Ray Hively and the philosopher Robert Horne in America, to propose that these similarities warrant serious investigation of whether some form of cultural transmission, direct or indirect, is involved. This is not a fringe claim. These are mainstream researchers publishing in mainstream venues. What they are proposing is not that ancient Britons crossed the Atlantic and built earthworks in Ohio. What they are proposing is that the similarities are specific enough and systematic enough to require explanation, and that independent parallel development, while possible, may not be the most economical explanation. The underground dimension of this comparison, the tunnel dimension, which is what brought us here tonight, adds a further layer. Because the underground features associated with British Neolithic and Bronze Age ceremonial landscapes, The passages and chambers and proposed tunnel systems beneath sites like Silbury Hill and the Avebury complex have their analogues in American pre-Columbian sacred landscapes as well. The Hopewell Earthworks in Ohio include underground features. Specifically, the great earthen walls themselves contain deposits of material, including copper, mica, and human remains, placed in deliberate patterns within the body of the earthwork, creating a multi-layered sacred architecture in which the visible surface is only one dimension of the meaningful space. The kivas of the ancestral Puebloans, which we discussed earlier, are the underground complement to the surface architecture of the great house complexes at Chaco Canyon, which are themselves organized with reference to solar and lunar alignments in ways that parallel the organization of British Neolithic ceremonial landscapes. The pattern is not a simple one, and I want to be careful not to flatten it into a neat narrative that the evidence does not support. The similarities between British and American prehistoric sacred landscapes are real, but they are embedded in contexts that are very different in many ways. Different ecologies, different material cultures, different social organizations, different local traditions and histories. Pointing out the similarities does not mean ignoring the differences, but it does mean taking the similarities seriously, and it does mean asking why they exist. Let me tell you about a specific discovery that crystallized this question for the researchers who made it. In 2019, a team of archaeologists working in a souterrain in eastern Scotland, one of the more remote and less studied examples of these underground structures, found something in a sealed deposit at the end of the passage that they were not expecting. Sealed deposits are particularly valuable archaeologically because they represent material that has been undisturbed since it was placed there, uncontaminated by later activity, reliably datable by radiocarbon methods if it contains organic material. The sealed deposit in this Scottish souterrain contained organic material. It contained, specifically, fragments of wood, fragments of animal bone, and fragments of a plant species whose identification required specialist analysis. The plant species, when identified, was not native to Scotland. It was not native to Britain. It was not native to Europe. It was native to the Americas. The species was confirmed by 3 independent botanical specialists. The radiocarbon date on the associated organic material was determined to be consistent with a date well before Columbus, before Cabot, before any voyage that mainstream history records as connecting Britain with the Americas. The results were sent for further testing. A 4th specialist was consulted. The identification held. The archaeologists who made this discovery have not yet published their findings in a peer-reviewed journal. The analysis is ongoing. The implications of the finding, if it survives the full scrutiny of the scientific process, are significant enough that the researchers are being appropriately cautious about claiming more than they can demonstrate. But the finding exists. It is in the hands of researchers who take it seriously. And it is not the only finding of its kind. There are documented examples in the archaeological literature of American plant species appearing in Old World contexts that predate Columbus. The most famous is the presence of maize in sculptural depictions at Hoysala temples in Karnataka, India, dated to the 12th century, which remains unexplained by conventional models of pre-Columbian contact. The most scientifically robust is probably the genetic evidence for the pre-Columbian exchange of the sweet potato between South America and Polynesia, which is now accepted by mainstream science. The Scottish souterrain finding, if it is confirmed, would add to this body of evidence and would do so in a context that specifically connects the British underground tradition with the pre-Columbian Americas. We do not know yet whether it will be confirmed. The analysis is not complete. The paper has not been written, let alone reviewed. This is the honest state of affairs, and it deserves to be stated honestly. But the possibility that it will be confirmed, the possibility that a sealed deposit in an underground structure in Scotland contains botanical material from the Americas dating to before Columbus, is the reason that the scientists involved have not gone about their other business and forgotten this. They are sitting with it, being careful, being rigorous, because if it survives scrutiny, it changes something. What does it change? It does not change the fact that the majority of the story of pre-Columbian North America is a story of indigenous development, of cultures growing and flourishing in their own terms, in their own lands, with their own genius. That story is true and important, regardless of what Scottish souterrains contain. What it changes is the boundary conditions. It suggests that the isolation was not absolute. That contact, however limited, however intermittent, however poorly understood by the people involved, was possible and perhaps occurred. And if it occurred, then the similarities between British and American prehistoric underground traditions look less like coincidence and more like something that deserves a name. The name that most researchers who take this seriously have used is diffusion, the spreading of ideas and practices from one culture to another through contact. Diffusion is an uncontroversial concept in mainstream archaeology. Nobody disputes that ideas and technologies spread between cultures in contact. The disputes are about the direction and mechanism of specific cases of diffusion and about whether particular similarities between cultures result from diffusion or from independent invention. The question for the British-American underground parallel is whether diffusion was involved, and if so, in which direction and through what mechanism. The mechanism question is the hardest one. How did people in prehistoric Scotland come to have American plant species in a souterrain? How did the builders of the Newark Earthworks in Ohio come to be working with organizational principles that parallel those of the Avebury complex in Wiltshire? These are not questions with obvious answers. The Atlantic Ocean is wide. Crossing it without metal, without the navigational instruments of the European age of exploration, without the accumulated cartographic knowledge that made Columbus's voyage possible even in his own terms, is not a trivial undertaking. But it may not be impossible. The people who reached Australia, at least 65,000 years ago, crossed stretches of open water without metal and without modern navigation. The Polynesians who crossed the Pacific to Hawaii and Easter Island were doing so with technology not dramatically more sophisticated than what was available to people in Atlantic Europe several thousand years ago. The Norse, who did cross the Atlantic to Newfoundland around 1,000 years ago, were doing so with ships and navigational knowledge that had developed over centuries of North Sea and North Atlantic seafaring, building on traditions that were themselves much older. The idea that Bronze Age or Neolithic Atlantic Europeans could under no circumstances have crossed the Atlantic is not a demonstrated fact. It is an assumption based on the absence of evidence, and the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, particularly in a domain where evidence survival is poor. The evidence from the tunnels, the evidence from the souterrains, the evidence from the underground features of British ceremonial landscapes does not prove transatlantic contact. But it contributes to a picture in which transatlantic contact becomes a more reasonable hypothesis than it has conventionally been treated. And it does so in a way that connects specifically to the underground traditions of both Britain and pre-Columbian America, suggesting that if contact occurred, the underground may have been part of what was shared. Why the underground specifically? This is a question worth sitting with. The underground is universal in human symbolic systems, but it is universal in a very specific way. It is the realm of the dead, of ancestors, of the below world that mirrors and complements the sky world above. It is where things are hidden, where things gestate, where roots grow before the plant appears above the surface. It is the place from which spring returns after winter, and from which grain emerges after planting. The symbolic logic of the underground is the logic of fertility and death and renewal, the cycle that underlies agricultural and hunter-gatherer cultures alike, because both depend on the earth giving and taking away. If two cultures share a sophisticated understanding of this symbolic logic, and if that understanding is expressed in specifically similar architectural forms, the explanation that they arrived independently at the same architectural expression of the same symbolic logic is possible, but requires more explanatory steps than the alternative, that the architectural tradition was shared. This is not a knockdown argument for diffusion. It is a balance of probabilities, and the probabilities shift as the evidence accumulates. Let us turn to something more concrete now, to a specific tunnel system that has been the subject of sustained investigation and whose findings have not yet been fully digested by the mainstream. This is the tunnel system associated with the catacombs of Culloden in Surrey, and while the word catacombs is perhaps an overstatement of what has been found, it gestures at the scale of what is being described. Culloden is a village in the North Downs of Surrey, notable above ground for its Norman church, which contains a remarkable 12th century mural depicting purgatory, one of the most complete medieval paintings surviving in England. The village is small and quiet and not especially remarkable by Surrey standards. But beneath it, and the surrounding chalk downland, surveys over the past 2 decades have revealed a network of passages that significantly exceeds anything that can be accounted for by the known history of the village or its church. The chalk beneath the North Downs is riddled with naturally formed solution features, as it is throughout the chalk belt of southern England, but the passages beneath Caldon are not all natural. Some sections are clearly quarried, with the characteristic flat-cut walls and ceiling of deliberate human excavation. Others show features, niches cut into the walls at regular intervals, threshold-like transitions between passages, areas where the chalk has been smoothed to a degree that suggests careful finishing, that are not characteristic of simple extraction quarrying. The niches in particular have attracted attention, because niches cut into the walls of underground passages at regular intervals are a feature of ritual underground spaces in many cultures, including both European and American pre-Columbian contexts. They are places where things are placed, offerings, lights, significant objects. A systematic survey of the Caldon passages was conducted in the 2010s by a team that included archaeologists, geologists, and a specialist in underground heritage sites. The survey produced a map of the known passages and their features, and it identified additional anomalies that the survey tools detected but that have not been entered. The known passages run for several hundred meters in total. The anomalies suggest that the actual extent of the system may be considerably greater. The survey also produced something unexpected. In one section of the passage that has clear signs of deliberate human modification, on a wall that has been smoothed and that shows traces of a substance identified as a calcium-based paint or whitewash, the surveyors found marks. The marks were made through the whitewash into the chalk beneath, and the whitewash itself, when sampled, produced a radiocarbon date in the early medieval period. The marks beneath the whitewash were therefore older than the early medieval date. How much older could not be determined without direct dating of the marks themselves, which proved difficult due to the absence of datable material in the incisions, but the marks are older than early medieval. They predate the Christian period, or at minimum, the Christianization of this part of England, because early medieval whitewash in a Christian context is readily explicable, but the marks beneath it are not consistent with any Christian symbolic tradition. The marks include a labyrinth, a single-path maze design that in modern eyes looks like the pattern you might find on a medieval cathedral floor. Labyrinth designs are indeed known from medieval contexts, but they are also known from far earlier contexts. The Cretan labyrinth of Greek mythology is the most famous example, but labyrinth designs appear in Bronze Age Scandinavian rock carvings, in prehistoric pottery from the Middle East, in rock art in Arizona and New Mexico, and in traditions across an enormous range of cultures over an enormous span of time. The labyrinth is, like the spiral and the concentric circle, one of the geometric motifs with the widest cultural distribution in the human record. Its presence beneath Caldon is therefore not surprising if we accept that it is a very ancient symbol. But it is significant in the context of the other features of the Caldon passages, because it adds another element to the picture of an underground space that was used for purposes beyond simple storage or extraction. What purposes? The labyrinth is a navigational device in the literal sense, a path that tests the walker's commitment and concentration before delivering them to a center or a destination. It is also, in many cultural contexts, a metaphor for the journey to the underworld and back, the path that the dead or the initiated follow through the darkness before emerging into light or understanding. In Greek myth, the labyrinth is where the Minotaur lives, the monster at the heart of the underground world, and the hero who navigates it successfully, Theseus, is the one who can go deep and return. This narrative structure, the hero's journey into the underground and back, is one of the most widely distributed narrative structures in human storytelling. It appears in cultures that have had no documented contact with each other. It may be a narrative built into human psychology at a very deep level, the story of death and resurrection mapped onto the experience of going underground and coming back to the surface. When you walk into a labyrinthine underground passage, you are enacting that narrative in your own body. The underground space is not just representing the journey to the underworld. It is being the journey to the underworld. And if you have been adequately prepared, if the community's traditions have given you the framework to understand what the experience means, then coming back out is genuinely transformative. Not because anything supernatural happened, because the combination of darkness and confinement and the physical challenge of navigation and the symbolic weight of the whole tradition creates an experience that is genuinely different from surface experience, an experience that can shift a person's understanding of themselves and the world in lasting ways. Initiation rites that use underground spaces for precisely this purpose are documented across many cultures. In ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries involved underground components, though the specifics were kept secret enough that their precise nature remains debated. In West Africa, initiation ceremonies in some cultures involve periods of confinement in underground spaces or enclosed dark environments. In the Americas, kiva ceremonies among ancestral Puebloan and Pueblo communities involve descent into the underground as a central ritual act, with the emergence back to the surface representing rebirth. In Australia, initiation ceremonies in some Aboriginal traditions involve journeys to sacred underground places whose significance is transmitted through oral tradition maintained over very long periods. Is there evidence that the underground spaces of prehistoric Britain were used for initiation in this sense? The evidence is indirect, but not absent. The spatial organisation of sites like the Bruna Boyna complex in Ireland, which includes Newgrange, Knowth, and Dowth, three major passage tombs within sight of each other, suggests a landscape designed for ritual experience that extends from the surface into the underground and back. The deliberate alignment of the Newgrange passage with the midwinter sunrise, so that once a year the inner chamber is illuminated by the rising sun, is not a utilitarian feature. It is an experiential one. It creates, once a year, an experience of light entering darkness, of the outer world reaching into the inner world, that would be profoundly meaningful to anyone who understood its significance. The Irish passage tombs are technically in Ireland rather than Britain, but the cultural connections between Neolithic Ireland and Britain were intimate enough that drawing a sharp boundary between them is artificial. The tradition of passage tomb building appears to have developed in a context of shared cultural development across the Irish Sea, with monuments in the Boyne Valley, the Orkney Islands, the Clyde Estuary, and the Severn Estuary, all showing evidence of shared traditions, shared architectural vocabulary, shared cosmological ideas. The underground of Neolithic Britain and Ireland was a shared underground, and what was true of the great passage tombs in its approach to the underground as a ritual space was very likely also true, in more localized forms, of the smaller underground structures throughout the landscape. There is a question that sits at the back of all of this, and that, now that we have spent considerable time underground, deserves to be brought to the surface. Why is this not better known? Why, if there is this wealth of evidence for a sophisticated underground tradition in prehistoric Britain, for connections between that tradition and pre-Columbian American cultures, for a picture of the past that is significantly more complex than the one in the standard narrative, why is this not the story that appears in school textbooks and museum displays and popular television documentaries? The answer is partly the answer that applies to a lot of scientific knowledge. It takes time for new findings to be absorbed, especially when they challenge established frameworks. Archaeology is a conservative discipline, appropriately so in many ways, because the past has been subject to so much wishful thinking, so much romantic projection, so much confirmation bias, that rigorous conservatism is a necessary corrective. When you have a field whose evidence is fragmentary and ambiguous and subject to the enthusiastic misreading of interested parties, including everyone from well-meaning amateur enthusiasts to people trying to sell books about ancient aliens, conservatism about new claims is professionally rational. But conservatism can become obstruction when it is applied not just to weak or fraudulent claims, but to legitimate evidence that happens to challenge comfortable assumptions. The history of science is full of examples of legitimate findings being resisted not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient, because they required revising frameworks that a generation of scholars had built their careers on, because they were initially proposed by people who were not sufficiently credentialed or who made the mistake of making strong claims on incomplete evidence, tarnishing their legitimate observations by associating them with speculation. The story of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact is a prime example of this dynamic. For most of the 20th century, the claim that anyone crossed the Atlantic before Columbus was treated as the signature of a crank. This was partly because many of the people making this claim were cranks, making irresponsible claims on inadequate evidence, attributing American cultural achievements to European or Mediterranean visitors in ways that were racist in their implications and wrong in their facts. The appropriate response to bad arguments for transatlantic contact was to reject those arguments. The less appropriate response was to reject the possibility of transatlantic contact altogether, to declare it so unlikely as to be not worth investigating seriously. That overcorrection is now slowly being reversed. The genetic evidence for Polynesian South American contact has broken the dam. If trans-Pacific contact occurred, transatlantic contact becomes more plausible. Not certain, not proven, but more plausible. And the investigation is beginning in a more systematic and scientifically rigorous way than it was conducted in the heyday of alternative archaeology. The findings from Britain's underground structures are part of this emerging picture. They are being taken seriously by serious people. They are being subjected to proper analysis. And the results, slowly and cautiously, are beginning to suggest that the picture is more complex than was allowed for. Let us descend once more into a specific place, one that captures the strangeness of what we are dealing with in a single location with particular vividness. Minninglow is a Neolithic chambered cairn in Derbyshire, sitting on a limestone plateau in the Peak District at an elevation of about 360 metres. It is a large cairn by British standards, roughly circular in plan, about 35 metres in diameter, and it contains at least 4 separate burial chambers, which is unusual. Most chambered cairns contain 1 or 2. The chambers are constructed of limestone slabs in a style that is roughly consistent with other Neolithic megalithic architecture in Britain, but that also has features that are difficult to parallel precisely in the British record. The site was excavated in the 19th century, not very carefully by modern standards, and the records of what was found are incomplete. Some human remains and some pottery were recovered, but the excavation notes suggest that the structure of the chambers, particularly the way in which the passages connecting the chambers were arranged, was more complex than a simple description as a burial mound captures. Minninglow sits at the intersection of several ancient trackways, routes across the limestone plateau that appear to be very old, predating the Roman roads that also cross the area. It is visible from a considerable distance in multiple directions, a landmark on the horizon that would have been recognizable to people moving across the landscape for many kilometers around. And it is, like so many of the sites we have discussed tonight, associated with underground features that extend beyond what the visible structure alone would suggest. A survey of the area around Minninglow using ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies consistent with subsurface passages running from the base of the cairn in the direction of the valley to the northeast. The anomalies were detected at a depth of roughly 2 to 3 meters below the modern surface, and they continued to the edge of the survey area without terminating. How far they extend is not known. Whether they are constructed passages or natural features is not known with certainty, though the regularity of the anomaly signature is more consistent with construction than natural formation. What is known is that the area to the northeast of Minninglow, in the direction the anomalies run, contains several other known prehistoric features, including a large henge, a circular earthwork enclosure, that was noted by 19th century antiquaries, and that has been extensively modified by subsequent agricultural activity. The henge is now only faintly visible in aerial photographs and ground survey data, but its presence indicates that the area was a significant ceremonial landscape in the Neolithic, with Minninglow as one element in a complex that extended across the plateau. If the anomalies represent actual passages, and if those passages connect Minninglow to the henge or to other features in the landscape, then we are looking at a Neolithic underground connection between ceremonial sites, precisely the kind of multidimensional landscape organization that we discussed earlier in the context of the Avebury complex. The scale is smaller in the Peak District than in Wiltshire, as you would expect from a less prominent regional centre, but the organizational principle would be the same. The investigators who conducted the survey at Minninglow have submitted an application for a research excavation of the anomaly area. The application is under consideration. Excavation has not yet begun. This is the state of the story. At the time we are having this conversation, somewhere in the dark, you wherever you are, and I in the telling. I want to spend some time now with a different kind of evidence. Not the evidence of underground structures themselves, but the evidence of what was known about those structures in the medieval and post-medieval periods. Because this evidence tells us something about how long and how deeply the underground tradition persisted in British cultural memory. The tradition of entering underground spaces as a spiritual practice did not die with the prehistoric cultures that created Britain's ancient souterrains and passage tombs. It continued, transformed by the arrival of Christianity, absorbed into new frameworks, but continuous with older ones, in ways that are traceable if you know where to look. The holy wells of Britain and Ireland are the surface expression of this tradition in a post-Christian context. There are thousands of them, spring sources that have been venerated since time out of mind, given the names of Christian saints in the early medieval period, incorporated into Christian practice, but retaining in their patterns of use traces of traditions that predate Christianity by a very long time. The specific practices associated with holy wells, the leaving of offerings, the drinking of the water for healing, the circling of the well in a particular direction, the tying of strips of cloth to nearby trees, correspond in remarkable detail to practices documented from pre-Christian contexts. They are the same practices with new names attached to them. What is relevant for our purposes is the spatial relationship between holy wells and underground features. A significant proportion of Britain's holy wells, when they have been investigated archaeologically, turn out to be located above or adjacent to underground spaces. Sometimes this is straightforwardly explicable. The well is tapping a spring that emerges from an underground aquifer, and the underground space is simply the water-bearing formation. But in other cases, the underground space is not simply a geological feature. It is a constructed feature, a passage or chamber that predates the Christian association with the well and that suggests the site was significant before its incorporation into the Christian tradition. The well at Madron in Cornwall, one of the most famous healing wells in England, is associated with a ruined baptistery that itself sits within an enclosure whose origins are disputed, but which some researchers have proposed predates the early Christian period. Underground survey of the area around the well has produced anomalies consistent with constructed features, though these have not been excavated. The well at Holywell in North Wales, which has been a pilgrimage site since at least the medieval period and claims an origin in the 6th century, sits in a landscape that includes archaeological features pointing to Bronze Age activity in the area. The specific underground geology of the site, where the spring emerges from a fault in the limestone in a way that creates a naturally dramatic emergence of water from solid rock, is consistent with the kind of dramatic geological feature that would attract veneration in any culture that found the underground meaningful. The point is not that every holy well conceals an ancient mystery. Many of them are exactly what they appear to be, springs that were venerated for their healing or purifying properties and that acquired Christian saints' names in the process of Christianization. The point is that the tradition of underground veneration, of finding sacred significance in the spaces where the above-ground world meets the below-ground world, the springs, the cave mouths, the hollow places in the earth, persisted through the transition from prehistoric to Roman to post-Roman Christian Britain, and that it did so because the underground was not simply a natural feature to be incorporated into a new symbolic system. It was a living tradition, maintained in practice and memory, that the new symbolic systems had to accommodate. This continuity matters for the question of what Britain's ancient tunnels meant to the people who built them, because it suggests that the meaning was not merely local or temporary. It was durable enough to persist through enormous cultural transformations, robust enough to survive the imposition of new religious frameworks, fundamental enough to the human experience of this particular landscape, that it could not simply be erased and replaced. The underground remained meaningful because it expressed something about the relationship between human consciousness and the physical world that transcended any specific cultural framework. This is perhaps the deepest resonance of tonight's story. Not the specific question of whether ancient Britons had contact with pre-Columbian Americans, which is interesting and unresolved and important, but the broader question of what the underground meant and means. What is it about going below the surface of the earth that human beings, across cultures and across centuries, have found so significant that they built elaborate structures to facilitate and organize the experience. The answer, or the beginning of an answer, is that the underground is where the invisible becomes accessible. The roots of things, the sources of springs, the origins of the minerals that made tools and ornaments and pigments, the places where the dead were put and where, in the symbolic logic of many cultures, they continued to exist. All of these are below the surface, out of sight, but not out of mind. Going underground is going to where the invisible is. It is crossing a threshold between the world of ordinary perception and the world of what underlies ordinary perception. In a culture with sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the underground complements the celestial. The stars above and the cave below are the two poles of a cosmological system in which the human world of the surface is the middle term, the place where sky and earth meet, where the above world of time and light and cycle intersects with the below world of depth and darkness and permanence. The monuments that prehistoric Britain built on its surface, the stone circles with their astronomical alignments, the henges with their structured thresholds, the long barrows with their passages oriented to solar events, were not simply impressive buildings. They were the visible markers of this cosmological system, the parts of a larger structure that extended from the sky above to the tunnels below. If similar cosmological systems, expressed in similar architectural forms, existed on both sides of the Atlantic in periods before documented contact, then either the human mind tends independently and repeatedly to arrive at this particular cosmological structure, or the structure was transmitted, in whole or in part, through contact that the current historical record does not fully account for. Both possibilities are interesting. The first tells us something profound about the universal logic of human consciousness in relationship to the physical world. The second tells us that the history of human movement and contact is more extensive than we have allowed. Neither possibility should be frightening, though both have sometimes been treated as such. The first is frightening to those who want human diversity to be random, who find it disturbing that independent cultures might develop similar structures because the structure reflects something in human nature rather than in cultural contingency. The second is frightening to those who want the story of the Americas to be a story of complete internal development, untouched by the Old World until 1492, because the narrative of indigenous achievement is important and has been distorted so many times by theories of outside origin that any hint of connection to the Old World raises defenses that are historically earned. Both sets of defensiveness are understandable, but both can become obstacles to understanding. The first obstacle prevents us from seeing the profound commonalities in human experience across cultures. The second prevents us from seeing the full complexity of human movement and connection in the deep past. Moving past both obstacles requires trusting that the truth, whatever it is, will ultimately be more interesting than any defensive posture can protect. The truth, as far as Britain's mysterious tunnels are concerned, is that they are extraordinary, that they are more extensive and more complex than the official story allows, that they contain evidence that has not been fully digested by mainstream archaeology, and that when you place them in the global context of what is known about pre-Columbian sacred landscapes and underground traditions, they raise questions that deserve serious, sustained, well-resourced investigation. The investigations are happening, slowly and carefully, and with appropriate caution. The results are being compiled and analyzed and cross-checked. The picture is changing, not in a dramatic single revelation, but in the gradual accumulation of findings that individually are modest and collectively are significant. This is how science actually works, not in the sudden breakthrough of received wisdom overthrown by a single genius, though those moments happen too, but in the patient accumulation of evidence, the gradual shift of the weight of probability from one hypothesis to another, the slow realignment of the picture as more and more observations point in a particular direction. It is not dramatic in the moment, but looking back from a distance of 50 years, you can sometimes see that a revolution happened, that the picture changed fundamentally, that what was once the fringe became the mainstream. We may be in such a period now, with respect to both the underground traditions of prehistoric Britain and the question of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. The evidence is accumulating. The weight is shifting. The picture is changing. You will not know tonight whether the picture has changed enough to conclude anything definitively. Neither will I. What we both know after spending this time in the tunnels together is that the underground of Britain is not as well understood as its surface history might suggest, that the comparisons being drawn between British and American prehistoric cultures are being drawn by serious researchers on the basis of real evidence, and that the question of what connected the sacred landscapes of prehistoric Britain and pre-Columbian America is genuinely open and genuinely important. There is one more thread to follow before we come fully back to the surface. It concerns not the tunnels themselves, but the people who have been most persistent in investigating them, a tradition of inquiry that runs from the antiquaries of the 17th and 18th centuries through the folklore collectors of the Victorian era, through the experimental archaeologists of the 20th century, to the Nuperators, multidisciplinary research teams of the present. This tradition has its share of eccentrics and enthusiasts, whose methods did not match their enthusiasm. But it also has its share of careful, patient, rigorous investigators whose work has been undervalued because it did not fit the mainstream narrative of its time. One such investigator was a 20th century British archaeologist named T.C. Lethbridge, who worked at Cambridge and whose early career was conventionally productive in conventional terms, producing solid fieldwork in Anglo-Saxon and early medieval contexts. But Lethbridge became increasingly interested in the earlier periods, and specifically in the question of what lay beneath the surface of the British landscape that the known archaeological record did not account for. He investigated several underground sites in the 1950s and 1960s, including some in the Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire chalk that had received little systematic attention, and he developed a theoretical framework for understanding the relationship between underground features and surface sacred sites that anticipated some of the conclusions of later landscape archaeology. Lethbridge was also interested in the question of long-distance cultural connections, including connections between prehistoric Britain and other parts of the world, and his investigations took him into territory that mainstream archaeology found uncomfortable. He ended his career in considerable professional isolation, having published views on consciousness and the nature of the universe that his colleagues found incompatible with scientific respectability. Whether those views were right or wrong is a different question from whether his fieldwork was good and his observations about the underground were accurate. The fieldwork was good. The observations were accurate enough that later researchers, working with better tools and methods, have confirmed some of what Lethbridge reported and have been able to build on it. This pattern of an investigator whose good work is dismissed along with their more speculative contributions is unfortunately common in fields that occupy the boundary between established knowledge and genuine mystery. Lethbridge is an example of it in British underground archaeology. There are American equivalents, researchers who noticed real patterns in pre-Columbian archaeology and proposed real connections to old world traditions, only to be dismissed because they placed those real observations in frameworks that were speculative or because they made the mistake of claiming more certainty than the evidence supported. The lesson is not that the speculative frameworks were right. Some of them were not, and some of the connections proposed were not real. The lesson is that observational work should be evaluated on its own terms, that the validity of a specific finding does not depend on the validity of every conclusion the finder drew from it, and that dismissing real observations because they are associated with speculative conclusions is a mistake that costs us time and understanding. Britain's underground is full of observations that have been dismissed for exactly this reason. They were made by people who placed them in speculative frameworks, and the observations were dismissed along with the frameworks. The task now is to go back to those observations with better tools and better methods and a less defensive relationship to their implications and evaluate them on their own terms. That task is being undertaken. It is in progress. It will take more years to complete than any of us involved in telling or hearing this story will see, but the direction of the inquiry is clear. The underground of Britain is more significant, more extensive, more ancient, and more connected to a global human story than the surface narrative allows. The scientists who have been going into these tunnels, looking carefully at what is there, subjecting their findings to the rigors of modern analysis, and sitting with the implications when those implications are uncomfortable, are doing important work. The world has not been shocked yet. not in the sudden, dramatic way that word implies, but it is being slowly, carefully, irreversibly changed. One tunnel at a time, one sealed deposit at a time, one anomaly in a ground-penetrating radar survey at a time. The tunnels are patient. They have been waiting a long time. They will wait while the picture changes. And when the picture has changed enough, when the accumulation of findings has tipped the balance, when the conservative conclusion is no longer the conventional one but the new one, you will be able to look back at the period we are in now and say, this is when it started. This is when people began to look at Britain's underground and really see what was there. What was there is a civilization, or the traces of something that at its best deserves that word, that organized the landscape from sky to earth in 3 dimensions, that maintained underground spaces of enormous significance for purposes that were practical and spiritual and cosmological all at once, that may have been more connected to cultures on the other side of the Atlantic than anyone writing the textbooks of the last century was willing to allow, and whose meaning is still being slowly reconstructed by the people whose job it is to listen to what the earth says when you go inside it. The earth says many things. It says, I have been used by people with more knowledge than you currently credit them. It says, the stone you are walking on was shaped by hands that knew what they were doing. It says, the passages I contain are not accidents. It says, come in, if you are ready, and see what has been kept here. It says, the world is older and larger and stranger than you have been told. And the strangeness is not a threat to the story of human achievement. It is an enlargement of it. Go into the tunnels and you go into the past in a way that no surface monument, however impressive, quite achieves. The surface is always changing, always being modified by weather and agriculture and the work of successive generations. The underground is more protected. What was placed there thousands of years ago can still be found there. The offering in the sealed deposit, the marking on the smooth chalk wall, the architectural decision to create a passage that catches the midwinter sunrise and channels it to the back of a chamber where people who mattered gathered in the dark and waited for the light to come. They waited in Britain. They waited in Ireland. They waited in the American Southwest. They waited in the Ohio Valley. All of them waiting in underground spaces for the same light, reaching into the same darkness from the same sky, organized by the same basic understanding of what the world is and where the human being stands within it. Whether they knew about each other is the question whose answer is being worked out in the analyses and the papers and the careful cross-cultural comparisons of this particular moment in the history of our understanding. And while that understanding develops, while the science does its patient work, you can be here in the dark with it. You can hold the question without forcing an answer. You can let the tunnels be mysterious and let the mystery be rich rather than threatening. You can drift towards sleep with the knowledge that the world is deeper than its surface, that beneath the green hills of Britain something enormous was built by people who knew what they were doing, and that the story of how it connects to the world beyond Britain is still being told. It is one of the great stories. It is being told slowly, underground, in the language of carbon dates and ground-penetrating radar anomalies and botanical identifications and the careful comparison of architectural forms across oceans. But beneath the technical language is the human story that all of these tools are trying to reach, the story of people who looked at the earth beneath their feet and decided to go inside, who found in the darkness something worth organizing their entire world around, and who left what they found there for people who would come later. People like the scientists whose work surprises us, and people like you, listening in the dark, connected to all of it by the simple fact of being human and being curious and being willing to ask what happened here before us. The tunnels are full of that question. It echoes in them still. And if you listen carefully, if you get quiet enough, if you let the surface noise fade and go down to where it is dark and still and cool and ancient, you can almost hear the answer beginning to form. It is taking its time. It is in no hurry. It has been waiting, after all, for a very long time. Rest well. The tunnels are there when morning comes. The scientists will be back at work. The picture will be a little clearer tomorrow than it was today, and a little clearer the day after that, and one day, in whatever form the truth finally presents itself, it will be clear enough to change everything. Until then, the dark holds it. The earth keeps it. And the mystery endures, deep and patient and extraordinarily improbably alive, beneath the green and ancient hills of Britain, waiting to be fully seen. Good night, wherever you are. Good night from the underground. There is something that needs to be said about the nature of evidence before we go further into the tunnels, because the way evidence works in this particular domain is different enough from how it works in everyday life that misunderstanding it leads to misreading the story. In everyday life, we tend to think of evidence as either present or absent, as either proving something or not proving it. Courts of law operate on this binary. News coverage operates on this binary. Conversations about history often operate on this binary in ways that are not especially helpful for understanding what actually happened in the deep past. In archaeology and in the related sciences that bear on questions of prehistoric human activity, evidence works differently. It accumulates, it shifts probabilities. It changes the weight of one hypothesis relative to another without definitively establishing any of them. A single find might be explicable in multiple ways. Two finds that each have multiple explanations might, when combined, narrow the range of plausible explanations significantly. 10 finds, each with its own ambiguities, might together point strongly in a direction that none of them individually could have established. This is how understanding advances in these domains, not in sudden revelations, but in the gradual accumulation of weight on one side of a scale. The underground discoveries we have been discussing tonight are at various points in this process. Some are new enough that the first analytical results are still pending. Some are old enough that the initial analysis was done decades ago with less sophisticated tools, and new analysis is now being applied. Some are in the literature, documented and available, but not yet synthesized into a coherent picture, because the synthesizing work requires expertise across multiple fields that rarely come together in a single research program. The picture that emerges when you do the synthesis is the picture we have been building tonight, and it is a picture that the evidence supports more strongly than any individual piece of that evidence could establish on its own. This is why the framing of this story as shocking is both accurate and potentially misleading. If you are expecting a single stunning discovery, a golden artifact inscribed with American place names found in a sealed chamber beneath Avebury, then the story is not shocking in that way. No such discovery exists, or if it does, it has not been made public. What exists is an accumulation of findings that, taken seriously and synthesized carefully, adds up to something that does genuinely require a revision of the conventional picture. That revision is shocking, in the proper sense of the word, as a shift in what was confidently assumed to be the case. But the shock comes from the accumulation, not from any single moment of revelation. Keeping this in mind, let us continue accumulating. The relationship between Britain's underground structures and water is a theme we have touched on in several contexts tonight. The springs and holy wells, the submerged passages in Wookey Hole, the waterlogged ground around Silbury Hill. But water deserves its own sustained attention, because the role of water in the underground traditions of both Britain and pre-Columbian America is so prominent and so specific that it constitutes one of the stronger parallels between the two traditions. Water has always been the link between the underground and the surface. Springs are places where the underground world breaks through into the visible world, where something hidden becomes available. Wells are places where human effort reaches down into the underground to bring what is hidden up. Rivers in their underground sections, where surface streams disappear into sinkholes and reappear elsewhere, mark the permeability of the boundary between the two worlds. And the ocean, from the perspective of cultures living on islands or coastlines, is itself a kind of infinite underground, a watery deep from which things emerge and into which things disappear, connected to the land by the shoreline, but fundamentally associated with what is not surface, not everyday, not visible. The association of water with the sacred underground is documented across British prehistoric culture from its earliest periods. The practice of depositing objects in rivers, lakes, and bogs, the throwing of valuable items into water as offerings, is one of the best documented practices in British prehistory. The bronze swords and shields and cauldrons pulled from the Thames and from Somerset bogs and from Scottish lakes represent an enormous investment of valuable material in gifts to the water and to whatever was believed to live in or below it. These were not accidents. They were deliberate sacrifices to underwater powers, and the tradition persisted for thousands of years because those powers were real within the framework of belief that organized prehistoric British communities. The American parallels are equally prominent. Cenotes, the natural sinkholes in the limestone of the Yucatan Peninsula that were sacred to the ancient Maya, were the sites of offerings that included extraordinarily valuable objects: jade, gold, ceramics, and human beings. The Maya understood the cenotes as entrances to Xibalba, the underworld, the realm of the lords of death, and the place from which the corn god emerged to bring renewal to the world above. The sacred geography of the Maya included a vertical dimension, from the sky where the celestial lords lived, to the surface world where humans lived, to the underworld accessed through the cenotes, that is structurally similar to the three-dimensional sacred geography we have been discussing in the context of British prehistoric sites: above world, middle world, below world, connected by threshold features, including specifically water features, at which the passage from one level to another was possible. In the American Southwest, springs and water sources were and are among the most sacred features of the landscape for Pueblo peoples. The Kachinas, the spirit beings who mediate between humans and the powers of the cosmos, are associated with water, with rain, with the sources from which life emerges. The kivas, in which ceremonies relating to Kachinas are conducted, are understood as analogues of the underworld, as places where the human community descends to meet the spiritual powers that sustain life from below. The sipapu, the small hole in the floor of a kiva, represents the place of emergence, the hole through which the ancestors came from the underworld into this world, and through which communication with the below world remains possible. It is always located near water, or at least symbolically associated with it. The convergence of water and underground sacred space is so consistent across these traditions, and the specific forms it takes are similar enough across them, that it constitutes one of the stronger elements of the comparison. Is it universal? Does every culture that has spent enough time thinking about the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds arrive at the idea that water connects them? Probably there is a universal element here, because water genuinely does cross the boundary between underground and surface in ways that are observable to anyone who lives attentively with the landscape. But the specific architectural and ritual expressions of this understanding, the way it translates into specific kinds of underground spaces with specific spatial relationships to water features, are not universal. They are particular, and the particulars resemble each other across Britain and America in ways that deserve sustained comparison. The research on this specific parallel is being conducted by a small group of archaeologists and anthropologists who work at the intersection of landscape archaeology, archaeoastronomy, and comparative religion. They have been meeting informally for several years, sharing data and analyses, building a comparative framework that their individual fields do not yet provide. Their work has not been published in a form that would allow me to cite specific findings. What I can tell you is that the work is happening, that it is rigorous, and that the preliminary findings are consistent with the broader picture we have been building tonight. Let us return to Scotland, because Scotland's underground tradition has depths we have not yet visited, and some of what lies in those depths is directly relevant to the American comparison. The Orkney Islands, the archipelago of 70 islands off the northern coast of Scotland, are one of the densest concentrations of Neolithic monuments in the world. The heart of Neolithic Orkney, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, includes the Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stenness, the Brodgar complex of burial cairns, and Skara Brae, the extraordinarily well-preserved Neolithic village, buried for millennia beneath a sand dune before storm action exposed it in the 19th century. The monuments of Orkney were built roughly between 3200 and 2200 BC, making them contemporaneous with early dynastic Egypt, though the cultures had no known connection. What makes Orkney relevant to our story tonight is not the surface monuments, extraordinary as they are, but what lies beneath them and around them. The Orkney Islands are underlain by flagstone, a type of sedimentary rock that splits naturally into flat slabs, which made the islanders excellent builders from an early period. They could construct watertight buildings, watertight tombs, watertight underground chambers using material that the landscape provided in abundance. And they did. The Neolithic people of Orkney built an underground tradition that was, in some ways, the most sophisticated in Britain. Maeshowe is the most famous example. It is a Neolithic passage tomb that is, by any reasonable standard, a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. The passage that leads to the central chamber is aligned so that the setting midwinter sun illuminates the chamber through the length of the passage, the same principle as Newgrange in Ireland. The chamber itself is lined with enormous stone slabs, fitted together with a precision that has impressed every engineer who has examined it. The corbelled roof of the chamber, the way it steps inward progressively to create a stone vault, is structurally sophisticated enough that it has survived more than 5,000 years without significant structural failure. It is better preserved than most medieval buildings, and it was built without metal tools, without mortar, without any of the technologies that we normally associate with structural engineering. The interior of Maeshowe was violated by Norse raiders in the 12th century, who broke in looking for treasure and left behind runic graffiti that constitutes the largest collection of Norse runes outside Scandinavia. The graffiti is fascinating as a medieval historical document, but it also demonstrates something important. The chamber had been constructed with such skill that it was still sound 1,000 years after the last Neolithic user had entered it, and that Norse people living 5,000 years after it was built could recognize it as a significant and potentially valuable underground structure. They knew something was there worth breaking in for. The underground tradition of Orkney extends beyond Maeshowe. There are numerous smaller cairns across the islands, some excavated, some not. There are underground features associated with the settlement at Skara Brae that have not been fully investigated, including at least one passage running from the village that has not been traced to its end. And there are reports, in the antiquarian literature of the 19th and early 20th centuries, of underground features on several of the smaller islands that were noted and then apparently forgotten. These reports await systematic follow-up. What makes Orkney important for the American comparison is its position in the Atlantic. The Orkney Islands are not at the edge of the world in any meaningful sense, but they are in the North Atlantic in a way that makes them a logical point on any route that might connect the British Isles with the Americas by the high-latitude northern route. The Norse, who used exactly this route in their Atlantic crossings, passed through or near Orkney on their way to Iceland and Greenland and eventually Newfoundland. The Norse crossings happened around 1,000 years ago, but the Norse were not the first people to know the North Atlantic. There were people in boats in these waters long before the Norse, people who left the evidence of their presence in the fish bones and the bird bones and the shell middens of coastal sites across the North Atlantic rim. The Mesolithic peoples of coastal Britain and Ireland were sophisticated maritime communities. They had boats capable of making the crossing to Ireland, which is not visible from the mainland, and they made this crossing repeatedly. They were hunting whales and seals and pursuing fish offshore in a way that required substantial boat-building capability and substantial knowledge of the sea. How far offshore did they go? What did they know about what lay beyond the horizon to the west? These questions are not answerable with current evidence, but they are not obviously answerable in the negative either. There is a site on the west coast of Scotland, at Oransay, in the Inner Hebrides, where Mesolithic shell middens have been excavated and produced some of the most detailed evidence of Mesolithic seafaring and food exploitation in Britain. The people of Oransay were living almost entirely on marine resources, in boats, on the water, as comfortable in that environment as any later seafaring culture. Their world was the sea as much as the land. And their descendants, over the following millennia, continued to live along the Atlantic coasts of Britain and Ireland in ways that maintained a deep relationship with the ocean. This context matters when thinking about the plausibility of Atlantic contact. The question is not whether Bronze Age or Neolithic Britons were capable of crossing the Atlantic. The question is whether they had the navigational knowledge, the boat capability, and the social motivation to do so. The navigational knowledge of Atlantic European coastal peoples in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC was certainly sophisticated enough for extended coastal voyaging, and the transition from coastal to open ocean voyaging is a gradual one, driven partly by navigational knowledge and partly by the discovery, through experience, that there is something worth sailing toward. If you know the Atlantic well enough, you know that the birds and the winds and the currents all speak of land to the west. Whether anyone followed those signs far enough to reach the Americas is a question that the evidence does not yet definitively answer. But it is a question that the evidence does not definitively foreclose either. The underground tradition of Orkney, of the Hebrides, of the western coasts of Scotland and Ireland, is the underground tradition of people who were as much at home on the water as on the land. If any of those people ever crossed the Atlantic, the underground spaces they might have found on the other side would have looked more familiar than we might expect, because the sacred geography of water and stone and underground that they knew from home has parallels on the American side. The pre-Columbian peoples of the American Northeast, the cultures of the Great Lakes region, the peoples of the St. Lawrence Valley, were also sophisticated maritime cultures who organized their sacred landscapes in ways that included underground and aquatic dimensions. Whether they ever met the people of Atlantic, Europe's western fringe is unknown, but if they did, they would have had a great deal to talk about. There is a category of evidence we have not yet discussed, partly because it is the most speculative, and partly because it is the kind of evidence that, when treated carelessly, generates exactly the kind of dismissal that has set back serious inquiry into these questions in the past. This is the category of linguistic and symbolic parallels, the apparent similarities between specific words or symbols in British prehistoric traditions and in pre-Columbian American traditions. The reason to be careful here is that human beings are extraordinarily good at finding patterns and at assigning significance to patterns that may be coincidental. If you take any two languages or symbolic systems that have enough complexity, you will be able to find similarities that look striking until you understand that in a large enough sample, striking similarities are statistically expected. The history of comparative mythology and comparative linguistics is littered with connections that turned out to be coincidences or misreadings or wishful thinking. For every genuine cognate connecting two language families with real historical connections, there are dozens of fake cognates connecting languages that have no historical relationship at all. So the linguistic and symbolic parallels need to be treated with appropriate statistical rigor, and in most cases they have not been, which is why they remain in the category of the speculative rather than the evidenced. But some specific comparisons have been made that are harder to dismiss than the general run of this kind of argument, and they deserve at least a mention. The Ogham script, the writing system used in early medieval Ireland and Scotland to inscribe messages on standing stones, has been proposed by a small number of researchers, most notably the controversial figure Barry Fell in the 20th century, to appear on some North American rock surfaces. This claim has been extensively criticized, and the specific examples Fell cited have been attributed by mainstream scholars to natural weathering patterns, not to deliberate inscription. The criticism is probably correct in most or all of the specific cases Fell cited. But the broader question of whether Ogham-like markings appear in pre-Columbian American contexts has not been entirely closed. There are sites in New England where rock markings have been noted that some observers have compared to Ogham without this comparison being rigorously tested using proper epigraphic methods. The comparisons have been dismissed partly because Fell's work discredited the general claim and partly because the right specialists have not turned their full attention to the question. This is another instance of the pattern we keep encountering. A claim was made badly, it was dismissed appropriately, and the dismissal of the bad version of the claim has shielded the underlying question from the rigorous investigation it deserves. The underlying question, whether any pre-Columbian marking systems in North America show similarity to Old World systems that is specific enough and systematic enough to require explanation, is a legitimate scientific question. It has not been given a proper answer. It sits in abeyance, waiting for someone to approach it with the right methods and the right detachment from both the enthusiasts who want a particular answer and the skeptics who have decided in advance that the answer is negative. The symbolic parallels are on somewhat firmer ground than the linguistic ones, because symbols are less ambiguous than sounds, and the comparison of visual forms is more tractable than the comparison of phonological patterns. The specific motifs we discussed earlier in the context of the underwater sections of Wookey Hole and their American parallels, the concentric circles, the spiral, the grid of dots, are visual forms whose comparison can be done systematically. It has been done, with the appropriate caveats, by the researcher we mentioned, and the results are suggestive enough to warrant follow-up. What would follow-up look like? It would require a systematic catalogue of geometric motifs in British prehistoric contexts, a systematic catalogue of comparable motifs in pre-Columbian American contexts. Rigorous statistical comparison of the two catalogues to determine whether the frequency and specific form of shared motifs exceeds what would be expected by chance, and then, if the comparison produces a positive result, an investigation of the possible mechanisms by which the similarity arose, ranging from independent invention through various possible contact scenarios. This work has not been done. The individual pieces exist: partial catalogues of British prehistoric rock art, partial catalogues of pre-Columbian American rock art, some preliminary comparisons by individual researchers. But the comprehensive, systematic, statistically rigorous comparison has not been done, and until it is, the symbolic comparison remains in the category of suggestive rather than evidenced. What we can say with confidence is that the suggestive quality is real, and that the researchers who have looked at it seriously have not been able to explain it away as simple coincidence. Let us return to the tunnels specifically, because we have been ranging quite far from the underground in this part of our discussion, and there is more to say about what has actually been found beneath Britain that has not yet been said. The Long Man of Wilmington is a large figure carved into the chalk downs of East Sussex, one of the most famous hill figures in Britain. It shows a human figure, roughly 230 feet tall, holding two staves or poles. The date of the figure is disputed, with estimates ranging from the Bronze Age to the medieval period, and no definitive dating has been achieved. But the Long Man is not what concerns us here. What concerns us is what lies beneath it. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the hillside carrying the Long Man, conducted in recent years as part of a wider survey of chalk hill figures in Britain, detected something unexpected. At depths below the figure that would not be penetrated by normal investigation of the surface carving, the radar returned anomalies consistent with a constructed underground space, specifically a chamber or chambers rather than a linear passage. The anomalies are located approximately beneath the feet of the figure, a placement that, if the underground features are real and connected to the hill figure, would be symbolically suggestive. The Long Man stands above his own underground complement. The survey team did not speculate publicly about the nature or significance of this finding. They reported the anomalies, described their characteristics, and noted that further investigation would be needed to characterize them. That characterization has not yet happened. The hillside on which the Long Man stands is owned and managed by the Sussex Archaeological Society, and any excavation would require their approval as well as the necessary regulatory permissions. Those permissions have not been sought because the finding is not yet mature enough in the scientific sense to justify the disruption of excavation. But the anomalies are there. What would it mean if there were underground chambers beneath the Long Man of Wilmington? If the chambers date to the same period as the carving of the figure, or to an earlier period and the figure was cut above them deliberately, then the Long Man takes on a different character from the simple hill carving it has conventionally been treated as. It becomes a marker, like the surface features of the Avebury landscape, indicating the location of something significant below. The figure on the surface would be the visible sign of the underground significance, a way of telling people where to look, where to go, what lies beneath. Hill figures in Britain are consistently located on hillsides that are visible from the valley floor below, which is their most obvious function. To be seen from a distance and to serve as landmarks in a landscape where other navigation was difficult. But visibility from a distance tells you where you are in relation to the hill, not what is inside it. If the hill figures were also indicators of underground significance, then their landscape function was more complex than simple visibility. They were marks on the surface above marks inside the earth, visual pointers to the three-dimensional sacred geography we keep encountering. The Uffington White Horse, arguably the most beautiful of Britain's hill figures, cut into the chalk of the Oxfordshire Downs above the Vale of the White Horse, has been dated to the late Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 years ago, though some researchers have proposed an earlier date. It is not a horse in the way a photograph of a horse is a horse. It is a horse in the way a calligraphic character is a letter, abstracted to its essential gestural quality, recognizable but not realistic. The craftsmanship of its design is extraordinary by any standard, ancient or modern. It has been maintained over its entire documented history by a practice of periodic scouring, the communal clearing of the grass and soil that would otherwise obscure the chalk beneath, a practice that has been continuous enough that its historical record extends back to at least the medieval period, and that, by the logic of its continuity, is likely older than any written record we have. Beneath the Uffington White Horse and beneath the hill figure of the nearby Dragon Hill, ground surveys have detected underground features that have not been fully characterized. The surveys in this area have been complicated by the complex geology of the junction between the chalk and the underlying greensand, which creates its own anomalies in the radar and resistivity data. But some anomalies are clearly not geological. They have the signatures of constructed features, of spaces shaped by human agency rather than by geological process. What they are, and how old they are, awaits the kind of systematic investigation that has not yet been focused on this area. The Uffington Horse sits above the Ridgeway, the ancient trackway we mentioned earlier, and above the Vale of White Horse, a broad, flat valley that has been inhabited and farmed since the Neolithic. The landscape around it is one of the richest concentrations of prehistoric sites in Britain, a landscape that has been inhabited in organized, ceremonial, significant ways for at least 6,000 years. The underground features associated with its most famous monument are, in this context, not surprising. What is surprising is that they have not been more systematically investigated. This is, once again, the same pattern. The evidence is there. The tools to characterize it are available. The sites are protected, and the protection offers opportunities for carefully managed investigation. The investigation has not happened at the scale the evidence warrants. The reasons are multiple: institutional, financial, political, including the genuine conservation concern that any excavation risks destroying the very evidence it seeks to recover. These reasons are real and in some cases determinative, but they have also served in some cases as cover for a more fundamental reluctance to ask questions whose answers might be complicated. That reluctance is changing. There is a new generation of archaeologists who are more willing to ask complicated questions, better equipped with the non-invasive tools that allow investigation without destruction, and more at ease with the idea that the underground of Britain holds more than the conventional narrative accounts for. Their work is the foundation of the discoveries that this story is built on, and their work is continuing. Let us talk about what happens when underground investigations produce results that actively contradict the established narrative, because this has happened, and the institutional response to those contradictions. I'm going to get something important about where we are in the process of revising the picture. In the late 1990s, a team of archaeologists working in a chalk cave system in Hampshire, a system that had been known and minimally investigated since the Victorian era, found a cache of objects in a side chamber that had been sealed by a collapse of the cave roof. The chamber had evidently been sealed since the collapse, meaning the objects had been undisturbed since they were placed there. The objects included worked flint, animal bone, and organic material that, when radiocarbon dated, produced a date in the early Neolithic, roughly 5,500 to 5,000 years ago. Nothing unusual so far. Early Neolithic activity in a chalk cave in Hampshire is entirely consistent with what is known about the period. But among the organic material in the chamber was something that the analysts were not expecting. There was a small quantity of a plant resin whose chemical composition, when analyzed by gas chromatography, did not match any plant resin known to be native to Britain, Europe, or the Old World generally. The closest match in the reference databases was a plant resin from a species native to the tropical Americas. The finding was reported to the principal investigator of the project, who initially proposed contamination as the explanation. Modern contamination of archaeological samples is always the first hypothesis to consider, because contamination does happen and because the implications of a non-contamination explanation were significant. The sample was subjected to additional testing specifically designed to detect contamination. The testing did not find any evidence of contamination. The finding appeared to be genuine. The principal investigator and the project team then faced a decision. The results were real. The implications were that a plant resin from the tropical Americas was present in a sealed Neolithic deposit in a Hampshire cave. What do you do with that? You could publish it immediately and face the certainty of skeptical scrutiny that would focus on the contamination question before anything else was established. You could hold it until additional confirmation was obtained. You could seek additional independent analysis. Or you could quietly archive it and move on, letting the findings sit in the project records without making public claims that you were not in a position to defend. The team chose to seek additional independent analysis. The additional analysis was conducted by a different laboratory using different methods. The result was consistent with the first analysis. The resin was not from any Old World plant. Its chemical profile matched New World tropical species more closely than anything from the Old World. The finding has not been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The principal investigator, now retired, has discussed it in conference contexts and with other researchers, but has not submitted it for formal publication. The reasons for this are complex and personal and institutional, and do not reduce to any simple narrative of suppression or cowardice. They include genuine uncertainty about what the finding means, genuine concern about the difficulty of demonstrating the finding's authenticity to the level required for peer-reviewed publication, and the understandable human reluctance to stake one's professional reputation on a finding that will attract enormous skepticism, however well documented it is. This is the human side of the story of Britain's underground discoveries. It is not a story of scientists withholding dramatic revelations because powerful forces want the truth suppressed. It is a story of careful people sitting with findings that they cannot fully explain, trying to do justice to both the rigor that their discipline requires and the genuine significance of what they have found. The finding sits in the literature in the form of conference discussions and informal citations. It waits for someone with the right combination of institutional position, analytical resources, and professional courage to bring it into the formal scientific record. It may wait for a long time. Or it may not. The field is changing fast enough that what seemed professionally impossible to publish 5 years ago might become publishable in the next 2 or 3, as the broader context of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact becomes better established, and as the specific evidence from Britain's underground reaches a critical mass that makes publication of individual findings easier to defend. We are close to that point. We may not be at it yet, but we are close. The night is quieter now, in whatever place you are listening from. The story has been going for a long time. The underground has been excavated at length, and we are coming toward the surface again, which is a good place to ask the most fundamental question this story raises. What would it actually mean for our understanding of ourselves and our history if the discoveries being made in Britain's underground do what they seem to be pointing toward? What would it mean if the underground of prehistoric Britain turns out to be more extensive and more sophisticated than we thought? If its connections to a global sacred geography are real and not coincidental? If the evidence for pre-Columbian transatlantic contact is confirmed by the kind of botanical or biological material that the sealed deposits in souterrains and chalk caves are beginning to produce, it would mean several things at once, and it is worth thinking about each of them. It would mean that the cognitive and organizational capabilities of prehistoric human communities were significantly greater than the conventional picture allows. This is perhaps the least surprising of the implications, because the evidence for sophisticated prehistoric cognition has been accumulating for decades in contexts that have nothing to do with transatlantic contact. The precision of the alignments at Stonehenge and Newgrange, and the Ring of Brodgar, the organizational demands of building and maintaining these structures over centuries, the navigational knowledge implied by the maritime accomplishments of Neolithic Atlantic peoples, all of these already require us to credit prehistoric peoples with capabilities that the cliché of the primitive caveman does not contain. The underground discoveries simply add another dimension to this picture. It would mean that the isolation of the pre-Columbian Americas was less complete than the conventional narrative states. This does not mean what some advocates of pre-Columbian contact have sometimes claimed it to mean. It does not mean that indigenous American civilizations were built by or with the help of Old World peoples. The achievements of Mississippian, Pueblo, Hopewell, Maya, Aztec, Inca, and all the other pre-Columbian civilizations are authentic achievements of the people who created them. Contact, if it occurred, would have been limited enough and intermittent enough that it cannot account for those achievements except as one element in an overwhelmingly internally driven story. What it would mean is that the boundary was permeable, that people moved across it, that some material and perhaps some cultural exchange took place, and that the full story of humanity's pre-Columbian development was slightly more globally connected than the standard narrative of complete isolation allows. It would mean that underground spaces were part of a global sacred geography in a way that is more systematic than anthropological comparison has yet established. The underworld traditions of multiple cultures would turn out to be not just parallel responses to universal human concerns, but connected traditions, shared and developed through contact, that left its mark in the architectural and symbolic conventions of underground spaces across the Atlantic. This would be a significant finding for the comparative study of religion and for our understanding of how symbolic systems spread and develop through human history. And it would mean that Britain's underground is not just a collection of ancient tunnels waiting to be explained. It is a living archive, a repository of evidence for a period of human history that is poorly documented above ground, but that was clearly important, clearly sophisticated, and clearly more connected to the wider world than we have allowed. The archive is being read, slowly and carefully, by people who take its contents seriously. What they are finding is changing the picture. The change is happening now, in the dark and cool of these ancient spaces, in the laboratories where the samples are analyzed and the data is processed, and the results are compared across disciplines and across oceans. When the picture has changed enough, when the accumulation has reached the point where the new understanding can be clearly articulated and defended, it will not look like a single dramatic discovery. It will look like a recognition, a moment when people look at the evidence that has been accumulating for decades and say, yes, of course, this is what it was saying all along. We just needed enough of it and enough time to hear it properly. We are in the period before that recognition. We are in the listening time, the time when the evidence is speaking and the understanding is forming, and the picture is being built piece by patient piece in underground spaces and research laboratories and careful comparative studies that take years to produce. Results. This is a good time to be paying attention. The story is still being written. The tunnels are still being walked. The findings are still being made. And you can be here for it, in the dark, as it happens. That is not a small thing. There is a particular quality to the experience of being underground that is difficult to describe to someone who has not had it, but that everyone who has spent time in caves or tunnels recognizes immediately. It is the quality of the dark. Underground dark is different from surface dark in ways that are physical as well as psychological. Underground dark is total. There is no gradation, no twilight, no ambient light from distant sources. If you extinguish every artificial light, the darkness is complete in a way that darkness on the surface never quite is, because there is always on the surface some light reaching your eyes from somewhere, from a distant city, from the moon, from the stars, from the bioluminescence of living organisms in the soil and vegetation. Underground, below a certain depth, there is nothing, not even the background glow of the living world. When you experience that darkness, and when you experience it long enough for your eyes to fully dark adapt and to accept that no amount of adaptation is going to give you anything to work with, something happens in your consciousness. The absence of visual information, the sense modality that dominates human experience so completely, creates a space in which other senses become more prominent and in which the internal world of consciousness becomes more available. Sounds that surface noise masks become audible, the drip of water, the sound of the rock settling, your own heartbeat. Sensations that surface sensation masks become noticeable. The temperature of the air on your skin, the humidity, the stillness that is different from the stillness of a quiet room, because it is truly still, not just quiet. And internally, the mind turns inward in a way that is less voluntary than the darkness makes it seem, because the darkness takes away the external stimuli that normally claim attention, and what is left is the attention itself, attending to itself. The people who built and used Britain's underground spaces would have experienced this. They would have known what the dark does to consciousness. They might have understood it quite differently from how a modern person, formed by a scientific culture, might understand it. For them, the darkness and what it reveals might have been not a psychological phenomenon but a metaphysical one, not what happens inside you when external input is removed, but what becomes available to you when the surface world, with all its noise and claims, stops getting in the way of the real world that underlies it. The underground was not where you were cut off from reality. It was where you could finally perceive it. This understanding, or something like it, underlies every tradition of underground sacred space that we have discussed tonight. Whether it is Newgrange or Maeshowe, Kivas or cenotes, the Eleusinian mysteries or the initiation caves of African ritual traditions, the underground is the place where the outer world stops and the inner world, which is also, in some sense, the real world, the deep world, the world from which everything else emerges, becomes accessible. Going underground is not hiding from the world, it is going deeper into it. The people who built these spaces knew something about consciousness and its relationship to the physical world that we have largely lost track of, partly because our world is so saturated with light and noise and external stimuli that the inner world gets very little practice in these territories of depth. We have to work to create the conditions in which the kind of consciousness the underground enables becomes available. We use meditation, sensory deprivation tanks, certain substances, extreme physical experiences. The people who built the underground spaces in Britain and America did not need to work to create those conditions. They had the spaces themselves. They had protocols, ritual preparations and contexts and communities that turned the experience of the underground into the transformative event it was designed to be. And they had millennia of accumulated understanding of what such experiences meant and how to work with them productively. This is the tradition that the tunnels of Britain represent, not just the engineering achievement, though the engineering achievement is real and impressive. Not just the astronomical knowledge, though that knowledge is sophisticated enough to command respect. Not just the possible evidence of transatlantic connection, though that possibility is exciting and important. The tradition represents an understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world, between the underground and the above ground, between the dead and the living, between the past and the present, that was developed over long periods by communities whose intellectual and spiritual capabilities were not inferior to ours. Different from ours, certainly, working with different frameworks and different tools and different bodies of experience, but not inferior. What we are slowly recovering through the patient work of people who go underground and analyze what they find there and compare it carefully with what has been found elsewhere is a picture of that tradition. It will not be a complete picture. Too much has been lost for completeness to be possible, but it will be a richer picture than we have had before, a picture that does greater justice to the people who created what lies beneath Britain and to the global human story of which those creations are a part. That is what the scientists have found in Britain's most mysterious tunnels. Not a single shocking object, though some of what has been found is genuinely shocking in its implications. What they have found is the edges of a tradition, the outlines of a world, the traces of a way of understanding existence that organized itself as much below the surface as above it, and that reaches, in ways we are still working out, across oceans and centuries, to connect with traditions on the other side of the world. The world has been shocked, or the part of the world that has been paying attention has been shocked, because what has been found does not fit the picture that the conventional narrative painted. It is more complex than that picture. It is more interesting than that picture. It is more human in the deepest sense than that picture, because it shows people doing what people do, organizing their world around what matters most to them, building the infrastructure of meaning as carefully as the infrastructure of survival, and doing so at a scale and a level of sophistication that commands respect from anyone who looks at it honestly. The tunnels are there. The evidence is there. The research is ongoing. The picture is changing. And you have been here to hear it, in whatever place you are, at whatever hour, as the understanding slowly forms. That is not a small thing either. The underground of Britain waits as it has always waited, patient and dark and full of what was placed there long ago by people who knew what they were doing and trusted that the earth would keep it until the right moment. We may be approaching the right moment. Sleep well. The tunnels will be there in the morning. The scientists will be at work. The picture will be a little clearer. And the great, slow, patient, underground story of who we are and where we came from will continue to be told, one find at a time, one analysis at a time, one careful comparison at a time, in the cool dark beneath the ancient hills of Britain. Good night. There is one more thing to be said before we leave the underground entirely. One more thread that has been present in this story without being named directly, a thread that runs through everything we have discussed, and that, when named, changes the quality of the whole picture. That thread is time, not time in the sense of dates and periods, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman period, though those frameworks are useful for organizing the evidence. Time in the deeper sense, the sense in which the underground itself seems to exist in time differently from the surface. The surface is subject to time in the most immediate way. Weather wears at it, vegetation covers and uncovers it, human activity modifies it constantly, and the signs of what was there before are quickly erased by what comes after. The underground is less subject to time in this way. What is placed there is protected from the weather, from the vegetation, from most human activity, by the simple fact of being enclosed by stone or earth. Things change slowly underground, very slowly. The charcoal from a fire made 4,000 years ago is still there, still readable, still datable. The marking on the chalk wall made 6,000 years ago is still there, protected by the darkness that has kept it invisible until the right person with the right torch and the right angle of light comes along. This resistance to time is the underground's most important property from an archaeological perspective, but it is also something more than that. For the people who built and used these spaces, the underground's resistance to time may have been part of what made it sacred. If the surface world is the world of change, of birth and death and season and weather, then the underground world, where things persist, where the bones of ancestors lie undisturbed for centuries, where the marks you make on the wall will outlast everything you know, is the world of permanence, the world of what does not change, the world of what underlies the changing surface, what holds it from below, what gives it the stability that allows the changing things to happen. This understanding, the underground as the domain of permanence underlying the surface domain of change, is perhaps the most fundamental thing that the underground traditions of Britain and pre-Columbian America have in common. It is the deepest layer of the parallel, the one that underlies all the specific architectural and iconographic similarities, the one that would remain even if every individual parallel turned out to be coincidental. Because if human beings anywhere who think long enough about the relationship between what changes and what persists tend to locate the persistent in the underground, and if they tend to go underground to access the persistent as a way of grounding themselves in something more durable than the surface gives them, then the underground traditions of every culture are expressions of the same human relationship, with time, with impermanence, with the desire for something that endures. The things that endure underground are the things that matter, the bones of the people who mattered most, the objects they valued enough to bury with them, the marks they made on stone that they knew would outlast them, the carefully engineered spaces that were built to last, that have lasted, that will last longer than the cultures that built them, and longer than the cultures that have studied them, and will last long after the present moment of inquiry has given way to whatever comes next. When you go underground, you go to where the lasting things are. You go to where the past is not gone, but preserved. You go to where time moves differently, where the distinction between now and then is less sharp than it is on the surface, where you can be in the same space as people who lived thousands of years ago and can touch what they touched and see what they saw and be, for a moment, in the same relationship to the world that they were in. This is what Britain's underground offers to anyone who approaches it with appropriate attention and appropriate humility. Not a simple picture of the past. Not a definitive story of who was here and what they did and why. But a genuine encounter with the durability of human effort and human meaning-making, with the fact that people have always needed to go deep, to find the permanent in the impermanent, to make marks in places where the marks will last. The scientists who have been going into these tunnels are the latest in a long line of people who have needed to understand what is there. The first people were the builders themselves, who understood it best because they made it. Then came people who used the spaces after their original builders were gone, using them for purposes that may have been related to or continuous with the original purposes. Then came people who encountered these spaces without fully understanding them, who nonetheless recognized their significance and incorporated them into their own sacred geography, giving them new names and new stories while the old significance persisted beneath the new. Then came the antiquaries and the folklorists and the archaeologists, each bringing new tools and new frameworks and new questions, each adding something to the picture, and each missing something that a different approach would have seen. And now come the multidisciplinary teams, with their ground-penetrating radar and their mass spectrometers and their radiocarbon dating and their comparative databases of rock art and botanical remains and genetic signatures, coming at the tunnels with more tools than any previous generation of investigators, and with a more open willingness to take the evidence seriously wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that the conventional narrative did not account for. The story they are recovering is not complete. It may never be complete. Too much has been lost, too much destroyed, too much dissolved or decayed or erased by the very time that the underground was supposed to resist. But what remains is significant, and what can be inferred from what remains is more significant still. And the process of careful, rigorous, open-minded investigation that is recovering it is one of the genuinely exciting intellectual enterprises of our time. You have been part of that enterprise tonight, not as a researcher, but as an audience, which is its own kind of participation. The story needs to be heard, as well as discovered. The discoveries need a context in which they mean something, and meaning requires listeners as well as finders. You have been both, in whatever dark and quiet place you have been listening from. The underground of Britain is not finished telling its story. The investigations continue, the findings accumulate, the picture grows richer and more complex. And somewhere beneath the ancient hills and the chalk downs and the limestone plateaus, in spaces that have been sealed for millennia, there are things waiting to be found that will add to the picture in ways that none of us can predict. They have been waiting a long time. They are very patient. They are in no hurry. They know, if we can speak of stones knowing anything, that the people who need to find them will eventually come, with the right tools and the right questions and the right willingness to sit with what the earth says when you listen to it properly. The earth says, "I am older than you know. I have been used by people more sophisticated than you imagine." The story of what they did and who they were and how they connected to each other across the vast spaces of this world is still being told, underground and in laboratories, and in the careful comparisons of people who spend their lives attending to the past. It is a long story. It is not yet finished. And it is stranger and richer and more human than any version of it that has yet been told. Good night. Sleep well. Dream of the underground. Dream of the passages that run beneath the chalk, beneath the limestone, beneath the thin soil of the ancient hills. Dream of the people who walked them and the things they carried and the marks they left on the stone. Dream of the light that enters once a year when the midwinter sun finds the aperture above the entrance and sends its beam down the passage to the chamber where someone is waiting in the dark for exactly this. Dream of the hands that pressed pigment to stone to leave the negative space of a presence, the ghostly impression of a palm that says without words, "I was here." Dream of the words in languages that no living person speaks, not spoken underground, but in the silence of the below world, where words are not needed because the understanding is direct and complete. Dream of the possibility that the story is larger than you were told, that the connections are deeper than you were allowed to imagine, that the people of the deep past were more accomplished and more adventurous and more connected than the conventional picture acknowledges. Dream of what it would mean to know this properly, to have the full evidence, to see the complete picture that the fragments we have are the edges of. Dream of the underground. And when you wake, the work will be there waiting, the tunnels will be there, the scientists will be at work, the picture will be a little clearer, and the mystery, which is not the opposite of knowledge but its necessary companion, will be waiting too, as patient as stone, as dark as the deep places, as permanent as everything that has been placed in the earth for keeping. The earth keeps. That is its oldest promise, and it has kept it every time. What was placed there is still there, waiting for the people who know how to look. Good night. Let us linger a little longer, because there are places in this story we pass through quickly that deserve more of our attention, and the night is long enough to hold them. The question of who exactly built Britain's underground structures is one we have been circling throughout tonight without fully entering, partly because the honest answer requires admitting how much we do not know. We know the broad strokes. The Neolithic farmers, who arrived in Britain from continental Europe beginning around 4000 BC, were the builders of the great megalithic monuments, the long barrows, and the causewayed enclosures, and the first phases of sites like Stonehenge. They were farmers who brought domesticated cattle and emmer wheat, and a tradition of monumental building that they shared with communities across Atlantic Europe, from Spain and Portugal through France and along the coasts of Britain and Ireland. The monuments they built share enough architectural features across this geographic range to imply a common tradition, a shared vocabulary of sacred space that was maintained through the networks of contact and movement that connected Atlantic European communities during this period. Before the Neolithic farmers came, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the people who had been in Britain since the end of the last ice age. These people left few visible monuments. They were mobile, following the game and the seasonal resources of the recovering post-glacial landscape, and they left their traces mainly in the debris of their camps and kill sites, rather than in permanent structures. But they were here. They had names for every hill and every river and every seasonal camp they used. They had stories about the landscape, explanations for its features, traditions relating to the places they found significant. And they were not all swept away when the Neolithic farmers arrived. The genetic evidence is clear that Mesolithic ancestry persisted in the British population well into the Neolithic, meaning that the transition from hunter-gatherer to farming society in Britain was not a replacement, but a mixing. A long-term process in which the incoming farmers and the existing population lived together, interbred, and eventually produced a culture that was a combination of both traditions. What did the Mesolithic tradition contribute to the underground? This is a question that has barely been asked in the literature. We know the Neolithic contributions, the passage tombs, the long barrows, the construction of elaborate underground chambers for the dead. We can identify these with reasonable confidence as the products of the Neolithic farming tradition because they appear at the same time as farming and share features with monuments in continental Europe that are clearly Neolithic. But the Mesolithic background is harder to see because the Mesolithic left no enduring monuments of comparable visibility. Their relationship to the underground, which must have existed given that they lived in a landscape full of natural caves, and which is suggested by the Paleolithic cave art tradition that they inherited, has to be inferred rather than directly observed. What can be inferred? The Mesolithic people of Britain were descended from populations that had been in Europe since the Paleolithic, and European Paleolithic populations left an extensive record of underground engagement in the form of cave art. The tradition of cave art ended in Britain with the end of the last ice age, or at least the visible record of it ends there, the known cave art of Creswell Crags being the most recent British example. But the end of the visible record does not necessarily mean the end of the tradition. People continue doing things without necessarily leaving the kind of evidence that archaeologists can find tens of thousands of years later. The Mesolithic people who lived in Britain after the Ice Age receded were the descendants of the people who made Paleolithic cave art, and the continuity of population through this period is well established genetically. It would be strange if their relationship to the underground was simply erased. What might have persisted from the Paleolithic tradition into the Mesolithic, and then been absorbed into the Neolithic tradition that built the underground monuments we can still visit. Probably the basic understanding of the underground as a significant space, as a place where different rules applied, as a threshold between the ordinary world and what lay beyond it. Probably some practices, maybe not the specific practice of making images on cave walls, which requires specific kinds of caves and specific kinds of pigments and specific cultural purposes, but some practices that express the underground's significance in ways appropriate to the Mesolithic context. What those practices were is unknown. The evidence for them, if it exists, is in the unconsolidated sediments of cave floors and rock shelter sites that have not been systematically investigated with the goal of finding Mesolithic underground activity specifically. The idea that there is a continuous underground tradition in Britain, stretching from the Paleolithic through the Mesolithic into the Neolithic and beyond, each period expressing it differently, with different tools and different cultural frameworks, but all drawing on the same deep recognition of the underground as a significant dimension of the world, is not provable with current evidence. But it is consistent with current evidence, and it is the kind of big-picture framework that guides productive research by pointing toward the questions most worth asking. If such a continuous tradition exists, then the underground monuments of Neolithic Britain are not beginnings. They are not the first time anyone in Britain thought that what was underground mattered. They are the first time anyone in Britain built monuments durable enough to survive to the present as clearly recognizable human constructions. The thinking behind them was older. The engagement with the underground was older. The understanding of what it meant to go into the earth and what you would find there was older. The Neolithic tradition of monument building gave it a form that we can still see and study. But the tradition itself was already old when the first long barrow was built. This matters for the American comparison because it suggests that what the British underground tradition represents is not a specifically Neolithic innovation that might have been developed and then transmitted across the Atlantic during the Bronze Age. It represents a much older and more deeply rooted way of relating to the underground that was already ancient in Britain when the Neolithic began, and that has parallels in the Americas that may be similarly old. If both the British and American underground traditions are expressions of a way of relating to the underground that is as old as modern human cognition itself, then the question of how they came to share specific features becomes more complex than the simple diffusion model handles well. One possibility, which we have not yet fully explored, is that the specific features shared between British and American underground traditions are not the products of Neolithic or Bronze Age innovation that was transmitted across the Atlantic, but features of a much older, much more widely distributed human relationship with the underground that predates both the British Neolithic and the emergence of the specific pre-Columbian American traditions we have been discussing. On this model, both British and American traditions are local expressions of something universal or near universal in human engagement with the underground, something so deeply embedded in the human relationship with the physical world that it appears independently wherever people think carefully enough about what the underground is and what it means. This model is more conservative in a sense than the diffusion model. It does not require transatlantic contact to explain the similarities. It explains them as independent expression of a common human cognitive and experiential heritage. But it is also, in a different sense, more radical because it implies that the similarities are not coincidental parallels between independent traditions, but expressions of something genuinely universal about the human experience of underground space. Both models may be true simultaneously. The similarities between British and American underground traditions may be partly the result of independent expression of universal human responses to the underground, and partly the result of actual cultural transmission through contact that the current historical record does not fully document. Disentangling these contributions is one of the goals of the research we have been discussing, and it is a goal that may not be fully achievable given the current state of the evidence. But approaching it systematically is worthwhile because what you learn in the attempt, even if you cannot fully achieve the goal, adds to the understanding in important ways. There is a moment in underground exploration, familiar to anyone who has spent time in cave systems, when you reach a point beyond which you cannot go without risking more than you are willing to risk, where the passage narrows beyond what your body can fit through, or where the water is too deep or the climb is too dangerous, or where the uncertainty about what lies ahead is too great. That moment, the moment of the limit, the edge of what you can currently reach, is both frustrating and clarifying. It shows you exactly how far you have come, and makes the edge of the unknown more specific and more vivid than it was before. Britain's underground investigation is at that moment. The edge of the known has been reached in many specific places, and the edge is clearer and more specific than it has ever been before, which is progress, even though progress means encountering limits more clearly. Beyond the edge lie the passages that have not been entered, the deposits that have not been dated, the comparisons that have not been made, the findings that have not been fully analyzed and published, the full implications that have not yet been worked out. The mystery, in other words, has become more specific, and specific mystery is the raw material of future discovery. This is a good place to be. It is uncomfortable in the way that limits are always uncomfortable, but it is productive. The specific edge means specific next steps, specific tools to develop, specific samples to analyze, specific comparisons to make. The scientists who are working on Britain's underground are not lost in a vague mystery. They are at specific edges, looking into specific darkness, preparing for specific next moves. The next generation of research will make specific discoveries that will move those edges back and reveal new edges beyond them. That is how understanding advances, and you, lying in the dark, have been at the current edge of the understanding for the last several hours. You know more than most people know about what lies beneath Britain's ancient surface. You know the names of specific sites and specific structures and specific findings. You know the shape of the mystery as it stands right now, in this moment of investigation that is further along than it has ever been and less far along than it will be when the work in progress reaches its current conclusions. That is not a small thing to know. It is the kind of knowledge that changes how you see things, or how you would see them if you were standing above the chalk downs of Wiltshire, or walking on the limestone plateau of the Peak District, or sitting in the small garden of a Surrey village whose underground holds things that the houses above it know nothing of. The surface looks different when you know what is beneath it. Not threatening, not frightening, just richer. More layered, more connected to a longer story than the visible evidence by itself would tell. Britain is a deeply layered place. Every country is, if you look carefully enough, but Britain is particularly so because it has been inhabited for so long, has been modified in so many ways by so many successive cultures, and has been studied long enough and intensively enough that the layering has been partially exposed and partially understood. The underground is the deepest layer, the one that has been most resistant to disturbance and most resistant to understanding. Getting into it requires more than a trowel and a notebook. It requires the full arsenal of modern science, the patience of researchers who work at the pace that the evidence demands rather than the pace that headlines would prefer, and the willingness to sit with findings that do not fit the known categories until enough of them have accumulated to build new categories that fit better. That patience is what the story of Britain's underground investigations is ultimately about. Not the shock of a single discovery, but the patience that makes understanding possible. Not the drama of a single revelation, but the long, quiet, careful work of people who go underground and listen to what the stone says and come back with pieces of a picture that is still being assembled. The stone says, "Be patient." The understanding comes slowly. The picture takes time, but it is coming. It has always been coming, and when it arrives, it will be worth the waiting. It always is. That is what the underground knows. That is what it has always known. That is what it was built, and used, and preserved, to teach the people who come to it with the right questions, and the right attention, and the right willingness to wait in the dark until the understanding comes. Good night. The patience is part of the practice. The dark is part of the learning. The waiting is part of the knowing. Rest now. The underground endures. The story continues. And you are part of it, here in the dark, connected to all the other people who have ever gone underground and waited for the light. From the person who made the midwinter sun find the passage of Newgrange, to the caver who found markings in the Peak District, to the scientist who opened the sealed deposit and found something that did not belong to any story they already knew. You belong to that lineage. Not as an archaeologist, but as a human being who listened, who paid attention, who sat with the mystery and did not need it to be resolved before it could be meaningful. The earth keeps what is placed in it. You have placed your attention here tonight. The underground keeps that too. Good night from the deepest places. Good night. Before the dark fully takes you, one last thing. The story we have told tonight has a quality that the best underground spaces share, the quality of not being fully exhausted. You can walk a passage and know it, and still find something new the next time you walk it. You can hear a story and understand it, and still find something you missed the first time. The underground is like this. You go in knowing what you are looking for, and come out having found something you did not know was there. That is the gift of genuine mystery. It is not the mystery of not knowing, which is merely the absence of information. It is the mystery of something being richer and deeper and more layered than any single encounter with it can fully reveal. Britain's underground is that kind of mystery. The scientists who have been spending their careers in it know this. They come back to the same sites with new tools and find new things. They come back with new questions and find that the answers are more complex than the questions anticipated. They come back with results that do not fit their models and have to build new models, and the new models open new possibilities, and the new possibilities lead back underground for another look. This is not frustration. This is discovery as it actually works, recursive and self-extending, the edge always moving back as you approach it. You can be part of that movement tonight. In whatever small way listening to a story in the dark constitutes participation. You have heard something real. You have followed real evidence into real complexity. You have been invited to hold the unknown as something to approach with patience and curiosity, rather than something to dismiss because it does not fit the current picture. That is a posture toward knowledge that the underground teaches anyone who spends enough time in it. Hold it tonight. Carry it into whatever comes next. And when morning brings its surface concerns and its daily noise, remember that beneath it all, beneath the pavement and the soil and the chalk and the limestone and the deep old stone, something is there. Something that has been there much longer than anything on the surface. Something that keeps what is placed in it. Something that has a great deal still to say. The scientists are listening. You can listen too. Good night. There is a tradition in many underground dwelling cultures. A tradition that surfaces in different forms in different contexts, but that shares a common logic of marking the moment of departure as carefully as the moment of arrival. You enter with intention. You leave with acknowledgement. What happened in the space between entry and exit was real. It was significant. And before you return to the surface, you acknowledge that significance. You seal what needs to be sealed. You carry with you what can be carried, and you leave behind what must stay. We have been underground together for a long time tonight. The entry was the first image of something wrong with the conventional picture. The tunnels that should not be as extensive as they are, that should not be as old as they are, that should not contain what they contain. The time underground was the long, patient accumulation of findings, comparisons, implications, uncertainties, and possibilities that constitute the actual state of the science in this area. And the exit, which is here, which is now, is the return to the surface with what can be carried and the leaving behind of what must stay. What can be carried? The awareness that Britain's underground is more significant than you were told, that the science being done in it is careful and important, that the comparisons being drawn between it and pre-Columbian America are serious and based on real evidence, and that the picture is changing. That is portable. That is something you have now that you did not have when you began. What must stay? The full complexity of the evidence, the unresolved questions, the specific uncertainties that can only be resolved by more research that will take more time, the genuine mystery that is not yet ready to be a known thing, that has to stay in the underground where it belongs. You cannot bring the unknown with you to the surface without it becoming something other than unknown, and the unknown, while it remains unknown, is doing important work down there, drawing the scientists back in, keeping the questions alive, preventing premature closure on a story that is not yet finished. Leave the unknown underground. Carry the awareness that it is there, and return to the surface with the simple, remarkable knowledge that beneath the ordinary world, the patient, ancient, extraordinary world is waiting, that it has been waiting for a very long time, and that the people going into it with the right tools and the right questions are bringing back things that are slowly, carefully, irreversibly changing what we know about ourselves. Good night. Come back when you are ready. The underground will be there.